Sorry, I didn't realize I had my sound turned down so low. I just turned it up. Okay, I think there's somebody else that we're still waiting for, but I'm not going to wait anymore. We're going to talk a little bit today about the just a little bit about international adoptions. And we're going to spend some time on sexualized behavior, and we're going to take a deeper dive into that after lunch, only because one of the main reasons that we see people trying to give back their kids is because children very often come into adoption having been sexually traumatized. It's very hard to get through the child welfare system without having some aspect of that happen to a child. So we're going to spend some time talking about it, mostly because if you haven't had a whole lot of training in working with sexual trauma, you really need to understand it in order to help your parents deal with it. We do not have a lot of parents who end up giving back their kids. Most of my therapists understand sexual trauma. They understand how to work with it. They understand how to help families work with it. Where I see it absolutely dissolving is in the group care setting, where by the time families have either not sought treatment or sought treatment and it wasn't successful, many of them end up putting their children in congregate care. And that's where you see the failed adoptions. So our goal is to prevent failed adoptions. So again, we're just going to talk about this a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Last week, I think I talked to you a little bit about a case that we had, a kid from the Ukraine who came over here at the age of 6. And kids from Eastern European countries, there are a lot of children that have been in the past available from very poor European countries, Romania, the Ukraine, Russia. And what we very often see is parental substance abuse. A lot of the kids that are placed in European institutions have some level of fetal alcohol syndrome. It may not be the whole full-blown thing with the eyes and all of the facial, but they do often have some of that. What we've seen, and I have been to Eastern Europe, and it's absolutely true, it is, you can tell countries that have been under communist rule and then had communism fall. I went to Hungary at one point, and the amount of lead paint on the buildings was staggering. So a lot of these kids that come from Eastern European institutions are kids that have been exposed to a lot of toxins. Maybe they have had poor nutrition. Maybe they haven't been really taken care of. And the case that I talked to you about last week with Nicholas, that case might have been salvaged had those parents had any idea about that kid's background, and they seemed remarkably uncurious about what had happened to him in the first 6 years of his life. And by the time we got involved, he was 13, and the last thing I knew, I believe that adoption dissolved. The other thing you see with the Eastern European kids is that there's as with all orphanages, there's going to be a very low staff to child ratio. We talk about orphanages where there's one caregiver for 50 kids. So these kids are just not getting a lot of care. They're certainly not getting a lot of physical touch or nurturance. And with as with a lot of situations like this, older kids keep the younger kids in order. There's a lot of bullying. There's a lot of sexual play. So people who go to Europe and take these kids are often not aware of all of this. And what I routinely do, if I'm going to talk to, even if the child is older and the child was brought from one of these institutions, we usually try to get the parents to take a look at what might have happened to cause the child's current behavior. So the Eastern European is always tough. Certainly China is the easiest place to adopt from. It has been historically. They have obviously relaxed some of their rules now about not having more than 1 or 2 children in a family, but many of the adoptions come from China, and you are very frequently going to see little girls, little Chinese girls who have been adopted for all the obvious reasons that they don't value their girls as much as their boys, but and Asians who come over even as young children are often, very often, going to say, this was not a really good experience for me. Hold on just a second, if you would. I just have to answer a quick. Okay, I apologize. Again, I think what you're going to find with a lot of, I think I showed you the Korean girl last week who talked about how difficult it was for her. But obviously, Eastern European kids can blend in with the American look, especially as they go older. Chinese children are always going to look like Chinese children. And many of them, as they have gotten older, have talked about being picked on, have talked about being made fun of and discriminated against. And certainly since the pandemic, we've seen such a rise in anti-Asian sentiment, a lot of instances of Asian people being attacked for no reason. And Chinese adoptees will often say this wasn't the easiest experience for them. There's some kids that come out of Latin American countries, not a lot. What we find with a lot of the Latin American pregnancies is that these are young mothers. There's a lot of substance abuse. It's a different culture in some of the Latin American countries. So there's a lot more, if you ever go to any European country, there's a lot more smoking than you tend to see here. But these young women often don't have any prenatal care. They have often been exposed to substances during the pregnancies. So those children can be somewhat risky. Any of the African countries, this is Ethiopia, but any of the African countries, most of the African countries are very poor. And we still see kids being born, coming through the birth canal and having contracted HIV or AIDS. So the 2011 statistics said there were 6 million orphans and 1.5 million of them had contracted AIDS. And not so much on this coast, on the West Coast, for whatever reason, we have had a lot more kids who are now older that were born with AIDS, born with HIV or born with AIDS, and didn't even know it. We had one 17-year-old girl that didn't even know she had the disease. We had to look up the medicine that she was on to try to determine that that's what she was being treated for. And the other thing about African agencies, when we talk about the Hague accreditation, I've talked to you about the Hague accrediting body. That is really an international accrediting body for adoption agencies. And it's like COA or JCO or any of the things that we have here that are accrediting bodies. Hague accreditation is something that adoption agencies want to have because it proves that they have met certain standards. But a lot of the African agencies are not Hague accredited. Many of them are just very, very poor. They're very poor people who have gathered children together, and essentially you can sell children because you have them. But we usually we usually try to help our families avoid some of these international adoptions. We have a family right now, again, it's on the West Coast, where the family adopted the child from Uganda. And they have gone through quite a lot of difficulties with that child because of the poor nutrition, because of the fact that he wasn't cared for as a child. And you just have to be careful. Haiti, the earthquake in Haiti was a long time ago. Now, it was in 2010. But Haiti, again, is a very poor country. And the result of that earthquake left many, many kids orphaned. And we were seeing a lot of children being abandoned. If any of you are old enough to remember, that earthquake had long-standing effects, as will the one in Turkey. But we saw people, because it was such an extreme earthquake, would not go back into the buildings. So all of these tent cities grew up. And in the tent cities, women and children were very vulnerable. There were unwanted pregnancies as a result of sexual trauma and rape. A lot of children lost their parents in the earthquake. Many of those children were sent over to the United States when their parents were still alive and just had been separated from them. So that whole earthquake and the whole devastation from it has taken years to really recover from. And there are children to this day who don't know if their parents are still alive over in Haiti. But there were quite a few children that were sent over at that time. And again, Uganda, any of the African countries are going to be very poor, and they're going to have children that unfortunately are born sick. So the other thing about Uganda is that you have to live there. With a lot of these, even if they're poor, with a lot of these international adoptions, you have to live in the country. You have to establish a residency and sometimes stay there for 6 months. Well, there's not a lot of people that can do that. So it makes it difficult, and maybe there's a reason for that. And then we come to North American children who don't appear to be any better off than some of these children that came from third world countries with extreme devastation and poverty. All of the kids that are coming out of the child welfare system for adoption have got all of these issues. Now, we go through all those other 4 countries first, and then we get to America. So your job as adoption specialists is to really help adoptive parents, not to say don't adopt, but to understand that any child that they are bringing from another circumstance, whether it's Uganda or Miami, is going to come with a set of circumstances. It's going to come with physical and perhaps mental health issues. Many of them now are born substance exposed. Most of them have come in for abuse or neglect or some form of maltreatment. All of that has an effect on children's mental health and physical health and well-being. It doesn't mean that we tell people not to adopt. It means that we say, here are the issues you're going to face, and here's how we're going to remediate them. And that is really the team that you need to make with your adoptive family, that you are part of that team to help them remediate what has happened to this child so that this adoption can be successful. And again, what is the word we keep saying? Normalize it. It is a normal part of what goes on with adoption. I think I might, yeah, let's stop here, and I'm going to show you the rehoming video. The rehoming video, I've got a couple of these. This one just, it's a little bit longer than some. It's about 15 minutes long, but it really does explain what rehoming is. And it's really a tragedy for children. And if you end up with any kind of a circumstance where a child has been rehomed, more than likely there's going to be some pretty serious damage to that child. So let's take a look at that.
Is the heart of modern civilization, this story will surely change your mind. There, a trade in unwanted children exists, and the way they do it is distressing. It's known as rehoming, And when parents decide they no longer want their adopted child, they simply advertise them on websites to lure prospective new parents. It's as straightforward as getting rid of an old fridge on eBay. There's no vetting or court orders required. And these disposable children can be handed over to anyone. In fact, until you see it, it's difficult to believe. And we should warn you, it's quite confronting.
First up, we have Alicia. Alicia is a very special and very sweet young lady who is looking for her forever family. She describes herself.
It's a parade like no other. Abandoned children desperately selling themselves to win over a new family, a new start.
She also likes drawing and doing arts and crafts.
And in the audience, sizing them up to find a perfect match, are their potential parents.
Okay, Michaela, you look.
Traveling to this so-called matching event today is Tom, a teacher with no children, who is interested in 14-year-old Frank, given up by his adopted family 2 years ago and now living in a care home.
Today is important because I get a chance to kind of be a part of something, you know, part of a family that I've been waiting to be a part of for a very long time now.
If something happens, then we'll pursue it, and if not a big deal. Nothing gained, nothing lost.
But Frank is anxious to make something happen. He has much to lose and only 2 hours to convince Tom he's worthy of adoption.
Trying to show him the brightest aspects of me and to let him know what the darkest ones are.
Frank has sold himself well. Tom agrees to give his new son a trial run and will collect him in 15 days' time.
Thank you. Did the same.
But 6 months later, Tom decides they're not compatible. And again, Frank can only hope and wait to find a family who wants him forever. To see those children trying to sell themselves to find a forever family, what does that do to your stomach?
Oh, it turns it. It is appalling that we get to a place as unseemly as this. Appalling.
It is distressing, tragic, and completely legal. Here in the US, it's a phenomenon known as rehoming, where, along with matching events, troubled kids are advertised like goods on eBay and given to anyone who'll take them. Mostly they're adopted and often wear the scars of abuse and neglect. Most disturbingly, their parents have decided they no longer want them. It could be here in New York City.
In New York, it could be in Boston.
For Adam Pertman from the Boston-based National Center on Adoption and Permanency, rehoming is the heartless result of desperation.
Desperate people do stupid things and desperate things. There should be legal structures and social structures and professionals who know what the hell they're doing around all of this. If we don't protect vulnerable children, who do we protect?
It's an underground trade in children that could be happening in any suburb across America. It's estimated that there is something like 24,000 foreign adoptees who are no longer with their adopted families. And as we've seen, there are countless more waiting to be rehomed. To rehome a child here is breathtakingly easy. Parents who no longer want their kids simply sign them over to those who do. And that could be anyone, a desperate, loving parent in waiting, or a monster.
I think it's often that the child doesn't meet the expectations of the family. And so instead of working with a child, they're trying to rehome them,
Get rid of them.
dispose of them.
Megan Exon has 5 adopted children, 2 through rehoming.
Look at the little girl in her ballet costume with her flower in her hair. I don't know how you can give a child up.
As well, Megan is all too aware that not everyone who seeks out these children can be trusted. And what about the people who might be looking at these photos? Who might they be?
Well, it could be anyone. We know from experience, it can be pedophiles and people who are liars and cheats.
Well, this is like a shopping list for a pedophile.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
17-year-old Poppy knows the awful truth through first-hand experience. Like an unwanted pet, Poppy's former adoptive parents rehomed her when she was just 7 years old. They delivered her to Nicole and Calvin Eason, a couple they met in an adoption chat room who have since been exposed as serial pedophiles. Here, Nicole is caught discussing rehoming.
A family looks for another family, internet, word of mouth, you know, friends.
And her not so gentle approach to parenting.
I smack them in the mouth, and I've gotten them with a spatula. I have no regrets about it, no complaints about it.
The day that you were sent to the Easons' home, what was that like?
Scary.
What was scary about it?
Being dropped off by people who I thought that were family and not being able to see them anymore.
So this was your mum and dad, who you considered to be your mum and dad.
Mhm.
And did you understand why you were being sent away?
No, I was told that was just that we were going on a little road trip, and that's all they told me.
Poppy and another child from another family, 14-year-old Dimitri, would now experience the very worst of rehoming. What happened in that house?
A lot of things that shouldn't have happened.
How would you describe the Easons?
Scum, uncaring, heartless, self-serving, selfish.
Lynn Banks, an adoptive parent herself and a crusader against adoption scammers, uncovered the Easons online and was immediately alarmed. Did you spot that it was a fake as soon as you saw it?
Yes, they were trying to take kids into their home under false pretenses.
This shows how easily the Easons con people. This document is meant to reassure parents who no longer want their children that they've given them to the right people. It's a safety assessment signed off by social workers. But the Easons was pure fiction. When you became suspicious of the Easons, did you become obsessed with tracking them down and stopping them?
It was the right thing to do. And I couldn't turn around and walk away from that. You know, who else was going to do it?
Lynn discovered the Easons' own children had been removed from them due to neglect and suspected abuse. She told police as the Easons moved across the country of the kids they collected on the way. How similar was the story from state to state?
Very similar. They were doing damage. They weren't getting caught. They were free to move on.
Can you explain to me how Dimitri and Poppy were placed with the Easons?
Well, I mean, they met on our group.
Megan Exon ran a chat room set up to support other adoptive parents. Unaware of their background, she welcomed the Easons and introduced them to the other families. But tracking their every online move, Lynn alerted Megan immediately.
Well, I know for a fact that she has an 8-year-old and a 14-year-old from our group. We introduced them, but
Just 2 weeks before this call, Poppy and Dimitri's parents had dumped them with Nicole and Calvin Eason. Lynn's phone call was confronting and devastating.
A pedophile? Is this Calvin?
After having that conversation with Lynn, what did you do next?
The first thing I did was I called the parents, and according to them, they couldn't come for their children. And I decided if nobody else was going to go for them, that I would.
Shame on them in a big way. There are some parents that will walk away and not look back. The ugly world at times, let me tell you.
With no guarantees that the Easons would hand over the children, Megan immediately set off on a 10-hour mercy dash to right her mistake.
The house was ramshackle on the outside. It had garbage bags, it had animal feces, it had urine in the front.
So you go up to the door and you meet a fairly imposing man, I'd imagine. He's 6'2".
Yes, I'm 5 feet tall. I just said, I'm here for the children. And he said, well, you can't have them. And I said, no, Calvin, you can't have them. You don't have a right to them.
Lynn describes that decision as very brave. And do you feel brave?
No, I feel stupid
Why is that?
because I helped put them in that position.
And what did you think of somebody coming and rescuing you in that way?
I thought she was a hero of what she was doing.
You thought she was a hero? Poppy suffered what no one should, especially a 7-year-old abandoned child.
She was certainly molested. Nicole and Calvin walked around naked. They wanted the children to sleep in bed with them. They had the children watch pornography and as though it were a family movie.
So moved by Poppy's experience, Megan adopted her, and Dimitri found a family too. Although she was now safe, for a long time, Poppy blamed herself for being dumped by the people she knew as her mum and dad, who she could only recently face again. So you met up with your adoptive parents, your first adoptive parents. What was that like?
I felt guilt that I did something to them to make them do that to me because I didn't understand why. She told me she didn't think that she was capable of taking care of me anymore.
Have you forgiven her for not coming and rescuing you?
Not quite yet.
Incredibly, even after Poppy was saved, the Easons continued rehoming children. It took Lynn Banks nearly a decade of collecting evidence against them before the FBI acted. With the aid of her testimony, 2 months ago, the Easons were each sentenced to 40 years in jail for their crimes against children.
I just can't imagine being in a home with them, you know, and I just can't imagine being a little person under somebody's control like that, and the people having their way with you, and I just can't imagine.
In all, Lynn's unwavering decade-long pursuit of the Easons resulted in 11 children being saved. Today, for the first time, she gets to meet one of them. How are you feeling about saying Poppy and Megan?
Yeah, I think it's gonna hit home now. Yeah,
What's hitting home?
they're real. Those kids were real.
Well,
Yeah,
look, she certainly is real, and here she is.
she is.
This is Megan.
Oh, hi, Lynn.
Oh,
This is my daughter, Poppy.
can I hug you? I'm so glad to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Glad to meet you too.
To see Poppy in person is to be reminded of why Lynn did what she did.
I've wanted to do this for a long time.
To save precious lives from the most vile people.
I'm just glad you're safe. Yeah.
Let's go get the eggs. Come on.
Having found her forever family with Megan, Marty, and her 4 adopted brothers and sisters, Poppy has been given a chance to live a life she deserves. What do you think of adults who are able to leave their children with strangers who can just leave a child and walk away.
They're disgusting and they don't deserve kids themselves.
Do you think rehoming should be allowed in this country?
I hate that everybody's in that position. I think it needs to be regulated so that it's safe for the kids. But the child needs to heal from the rejection and the abandonment and the trauma. They have every right to walk this earth healed. So that's it.
Actually, that was a 60 minutes segment. Rehoming does happen. It is extremely dangerous for children because there's no regulation to it at all. One of the other videos that I have, it's called A Boy Named Moses. And he was rehomed to a woman when he was 4. And his adoptive parents were in America. They took him across the border to Canada and found someone that just shopped for him on the internet. And that didn't work out. And he's now a young adult. But when you work with kids who have had failed adoptions are absolutely horrible. However, if you then compound it with this kind of situation, it's really very difficult for kids to heal from that. I'm not even sure how long ago. I don't think that was filmed very long ago, but I can usually tell by hair. It doesn't look like it was a very old video, but it is absolutely true that those things happen. Those matching meetings that they started out with, where these kids are like walking up and down on the runway trying to sell themselves, do happen. The whole matching thing is difficult anyway, and it's always difficult because the kids know exactly why they're at this bowling alley or this picnic or whatever it is. But in many cases, those kids have already had 1 or 2 failed adoptions. So the damage is pretty great with these kids. Does anybody have anything they want to add to that? Has anybody had any experiences with rehoming? Or did you even know that it existed?
I didn't think that something like this existed. Like, I've known people who are trying to adopt kids and it's so difficult and expensive for them. Like, the process is so tedious. I never knew something like this existed.
Well, and that's why, Candace, because it is a difficult process for people to adopt, and it can be expensive, and people get discouraged and take the easy way out. I'm not saying that there may not be circumstances where a child is rehomed that way and ends up okay, but it is an open door to pedophiles. It's an open door for trafficking. It's a very easy way to get control of a child. Melissa, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was, I honestly, I feel kind of naive in that I didn't even realize that it existed. I know when I was watching that video, it reminded me more so of like trafficking than anything else.
Yeah.
I was very appalled.
It is pretty appalling, and it is like trafficking. It's if you were a trafficker, if you were a pedophile, that would be like a shopping list for you, because nobody is going to question you. And when you talk, you see that poor reporter, it just sounded like she was traumatized during the whole event, trying to work with this because she just couldn't believe that it happened. And it's amazing that Poppy, the girl in the video, was as put together as she was, although you could certainly see when they interviewed her, the constricted way that she talked and her whole affect is that's one damaged kid. So, yeah, I don't think a lot of people are aware that it is such an underground market. And that's why I always try to introduce the concept at some point during the training. Just that the more well-rounded you get about this, the more you know about all aspects of it, the better adoption therapist you're going to be, because you're going to hear all kinds of crazy things from people. So, okay, we're going to talk just a little bit about behavioral symptoms and assessment, because when you get these cases, we want you to look beyond this, because this is what you're going to get. You're going to get the referral, and the adoptive parent is going to call you and say, this kid is doing all of these things. This kid is stealing and hoarding and hoarding food in his room and lying and a lot of sexualized behavior, which is why we're going to get into that a little bit more. And these are the presenting problems. Of course, they're the presenting problems. These kids have come usually from very, very difficult backgrounds. But what your task is going to be is to make sure that you're always treating the whole family and making sure that once you've done your assessment, a lot of your job is to educate these parents who probably have had no exposure to any of this, to what happens to kids when they have been traumatized, when they have been ripped away from their families, in some cases their countries, kids that have come from other countries who don't speak English. Can you imagine how difficult that would be for a young child being taken out of an orphanage and brought to a country where he or she does not speak the language? And when we had Nicholas, and this was a few years ago, and sitting and talking with these parents, number one, all they wanted to talk about was all bad things that the kid had done, and that they wanted him put in a group home because he was a bad kid, and none of this at that point was their fault in their minds. But when we sat and kind of tried to flesh it out with them, okay, so he was put in the orphanage when he was 3 by his own grandmother. So what had happened between 0 and 3? The mother had already abandoned him, and now the grandma is going to abandon him again at the age of 3. He now spends 3 to 6 in an orphanage where he probably gets very little care, and they go over and bring him back to the United States where he doesn't speak English to them, and they can't speak Ukrainian. He was Ukrainian. They can't speak Ukrainian to him. They had just truly never thought about any of that. And because of this, because that whole attachment just never took place, and then the behaviors got worse and worse and worse, they really didn't want to attach to him at that point. They just wanted him gone. And you will sometimes walk into the situations that are too far gone for you to fix. And that's going to be difficult. But we always try to say to the family, we're going to all work together. We're going to help you to understand what your child's early years were like. We're going to talk about how that has affected him or her ability to connect to you. I'm always, when I watch that video, always attuned to that 14-year-old African-American child who has now had 1 failed adoption, and a guy who comes and shops and says, well, you know, we'll try. If it works out, it doesn't work out. No foul, no gain, with absolutely no thought to what was going to happen to that boy if he took him in and then it didn't work out. So this is really going to be your playbook when you're working with these families, is normalizing what's happened, helping them to understand the child's early years, educating them about the effects of early trauma, and then working on attachment issues. That's going to be your playbook. Now, how do we do that? You've got to really do a good assessment when you are getting into this. The prenatal history, age at the very first removal, what happened from 0 to 5 is something you really, really got to look at with your family. And I'm telling you, most of these people have had no exposure to this kind of thing. So they're not saying, oh, well, you know, he was in foster care till he was 10. They're not understanding the effect of foster care experiences have on kids. They're not understanding very, very often the damage that has been done to these kids in the first couple of years to their life. When we did the training, I think I did this training for you last week, and we talked about what happens in the first 3 years of life, but the first 5. You're going to learn almost 85% of life's learning in the first 3 years of your life. And what happens if the first 3 years of your life have been fraught with trauma? You've had no caretakers, you've been removed at a very early age, you've been placed in foster care. What happens to that learning? That learning doesn't occur. And that makes for difficult attachment. It makes for difficult development. And once you get into the foster care system, we call it system abuse. Foster care, as I was having this conversation with somebody yesterday, is an imperfect solution to an impossible problem. The foster care systems in all of our states here, some do it better than others. And some people believe that the Florida foster care system is very good. And Melissa just made a face. It's what we have. Has it been better? It has been better. I can tell you that if those of you who were around when privatization started about 2002, 2003. And at that point, we began to get all the private lead agencies, such as Safe Children Coalition, Community-Based Care of Volusia Flagler, Embrace Families. These are all private agencies that have taken over the foster care system from the Department of Children and Families. And they do it, depending on how much money they have, they do it slightly better. But it's just not a good solution to an impossible problem. And all of this, when you are helping your family and you're first getting involved with them, you need to help them to understand what this kid's early years were like. Because I guarantee you, if you do, if you can get them to understand what those early years, how those early years affected this child's ability to attach, you will have a much better start with your families. Because if you don't, they're going to, nobody wants to blame themselves for a problem. So the go-to is to blame the child and say, you know, he just doesn't fit in here. I just can't get him to understand that we want him as a part of the family. And once they begin to blame the child, then your job is a whole lot harder. So when you're assessing what are you looking for, always look for all of these things, especially if you're getting a child from another country. You need to kind of, even if you don't have all the information, you're going to have to kind of surmise this is probably what's going on. The family that I talked to a couple weeks ago, who had brought the child from a Russian orphanage, this child is now a young adult. And the mother said to me, I don't understand that he always eats so fast, that he eats like it's going to be taken away from him. And this is 20 years later. And we kind of, I said, I can't tell you. I can tell you what it might be. And it might explain why he's doing what he's doing. That in orphanages, if there's not a lot of caretakers, there's a feeding schedule. And if the child hasn't finished their bottle and they have to go on to the next bottle, then that child might have learned as a young child to finish that bottle pretty quick. And those things print, those kind of trauma imprints print on your brain. And it's very hard, number one, to figure out where it came from, and the child can't explain where it came from. So you as adoptive parents are kind of trying to figure all this stuff out. So you're going to look at what kind of experiences they had, what the history of physical or sexual abuse is. Now, there are not as many international adoptions as there were, but what happens is that you're going to get the kids that are now older, like this Russian boy, who at the time, some of these things were not very well known. We didn't know what was going on in in Russian orphanages or Ukrainian orphanages or some of those places. So if you're getting a family like that, the best advice I give to families is to study it. We have the miracle of Google now, and you can study circumstances that might have happened in a Ukrainian orphanage in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And some of those will give you some clues as to why kids are acting the way they're acting. But anything that you can gather about children during your assessment is very important for your family to understand. And sometimes they don't come with a whole lot, which makes it even more difficult. So, and then you need to assess the family. Why did they decide to adopt? You absolutely need to say, what led to your adoption decision? And again, if we look at protocol, you're going to get the referral. We'll give it to you. Enbridge will give it to you, whoever, and you're going to meet with the family, and you're going to meet with the family together. But then basic protocol is that maybe in the next session you meet with the adoptive parents, and then in the third session you meet with the child. Now, why are you splitting them up? You're going to split them up because you need to find out what was your expectation of this? What did you think this was going to be like? Very often people come to the adoption decision for a whole lot of reasons. Infertility is often at the forefront if they have no children. Something perhaps that happened to them as children that they haven't quite resolved yet. You need to ask, what did they expect this child to be like? And what did they expect themselves to be like as parents? Is the reality of what this has turned out to be matching what they expected? And very, very often, you're going to find that the expectations don't match. You're very often going to find that parents have a very grandiose idea about what this is going to be like. And you're often going to find that kids don't expect much of anything. So those two things don't really fit together very well. And you're always going to work in the context of the family. When I say one of your goals is to help this family form an identity, when I say who is the Smith family, I showed you the family shield. I think Sarah Allen doing that exercise intervention for the family at the end of treatment, where they identify who they are and they do a family shield and kind of identify what makes them a family. And that is an intervention that we kind of do at the end after they've had some work with you to identify who they are and what are their rules and what makes them who they are. And you can look at that on the Circle of Friends YouTube channel under interventions, under adoption I think it's under it, clinical interventions, and it might be under the adoption. But the purpose of the family shield is really kind of the end of work. But what you are doing is to try to help this family integrate together to say, who are we as a family? And what makes us who we are? What makes us, what are our good qualities? Maybe what are our not so good qualities? What are the rules for being in this family? And everybody gets to make those rules, not just the parent. So you're just always going to be doing this work in the context of trying to put your family together. And it doesn't happen overnight. It really doesn't. I'm going to do a little bit here about sexual trauma, just kind of an overview. And after lunch, we're going to do a little bit more. Let me just jump ahead here just a little bit. Okay, we're going to do a little bit here and before we take a break. The reason, if you haven't done a lot of work with childhood sexual trauma, you really need to get good at it, because there are very few kids who come through the child welfare system that have not had some exposure to sexual trauma. And the longer kids are separated from their families, the more likely that they're going to be abused. And that isn't because people are monsters, and it's not because other kids in foster care are terrible. If you are in congregate care, or you're in a foster situation with other kids that are not related to you, that you don't really know, and all of you have come into this situation with some form of maltreatment, the possibility for acting out goes way up. And that's why we do things, well, we have developed over the years, things in foster care called sexual safety plans, which, believe me, we did not used to have. I moved here in 1998, and I think you all know I went to work for Florida United Methodist Children's Home because it was 3 miles from my house, and they hired me. And it was a situation where, having come from doing a lot of sexual trauma work, I could not believe at the time how easy they made it for these kids to be abused. And it wasn't their intention. It was just that the physical plant of a lot of congregate care in the 90s was not designed to prevent children from being harmed. And by that, I mean, a lot of the cottages would have 2 kids in a room, 2 kids in a room, and a shared bathroom, so that every night 4 children could have some exposure to each other. We've learned a lot in the last 20 years, and a lot of, and the children's home included, a lot of congregate care have redesigned their cottages, and children no longer share rooms, and they no longer share bathrooms, and they have a lot more protection than they did, but it wasn't always that way. And in fact, when was it? I think it was 2008. One of the lead agencies, and that lead agency happens to be gone now, so but they were the lead agency for Orange and Osceola County, and they had been cited by the Department of Children and Families because their foster homes did not have safety measures in place, and children were being molested in the foster homes. And one of my jobs as a consultant was to develop a safety plan for foster parents within this agency. And we did a lot of work on trying to help foster parents to understand the different kinds of things that they could do to protect kids from being molested. And it was kind of simple stuff. It was, if a child comes into your home, nobody is to go into the bedroom with them. The door is to never be shut if they're in the bedroom, and nobody else is going to go in there with them. Nobody's going to go into the bathroom with them. We as therapists kind of routinely would go into homes and see the child in their bedroom and shut the door, and without even thinking that that might be a little threatening to a traumatized child who had been molested. So we, as the therapeutic community, had to learn a little bit too, didn't we? We had to learn a little bit about what it is like to be a very vulnerable child, and to have an adult come into the bedroom and shut the door. Even an adult that we think, well, we're good people, we're here to help you, but the kids didn't always understand that. So we need to understand childhood trauma, sexual trauma, because so many of our kids are going to come in with that kind of behavior. When we look at childhood sexual behavior, and some of you have been through some of my other trainings where we talk about some of this, but there's normal sexual behavior. All kids have sexual behavior, and there's normal, and there's red flag behavior, and then there are those things that we look at a kid doing and we say there's no question but that this child has been abused. But most kids are going to masturbate very, very often. Children, even little kids, they just don't think about it. It feels good. And we, as the parents of those children, teach them to do it in private. When we have kids that are coming into foster care that have knowledge of sex that they shouldn't have for their age, if they're drawing pictures of things that they shouldn't know about, if they're drawing pictures of different sexual acts, then we are concerned, and we teach our foster and our adoptive parents to be concerned. Red flags are more definite forced exposure of others, of somebody's genitals. We say, okay, that's a red flag. And the no question is when they do things that act out sexual behavior. Now, if we see any of these things with the children that we're working with, these are the things that cause adoptive parents to go crazy and call congregate care and say, come and get this kid. You just need to understand how to help your adoptive parents work with these behaviors to remediate them. And they can. We do a lot of work with our adoptive parents around this. And there's probably nobody at Circle of Friends that has not seen this picture at this point, because it's a very old picture. And this girl was 13 years old when she drew this picture for me. And she had just testified against her father in a trial that she said he had molested her. And she was in a group home at the time. And her father was convicted for lewd and lascivious on a child under 12. And he had been sentenced to life without parole. And I think this might have been the second time I saw this girl. I just asked her to draw me a picture. If ever you want to have a good diagnostic tool that only needs a piece of paper and a pencil, all you need is draw a person. So I asked her to draw me a picture. And what would concern you about this picture of this girl? Is there anything that looks like you wouldn't expect to see? Because I'm telling you, she drew herself. This was the outfit she had on. Most of the time, if you ask your client to draw a picture, they're going to draw some representation of themselves. So what do you notice about this girl, knowing that she's been molested? What is the difference from the neck up and the neck down? What do you notice about her from the neck up?
Her lips, they're big.
Everybody gets the lips. In this age of Botoxy lips, everybody gets the lips. Thank you. That's right. From the neck up, she has drawn a very sexualized individual. But from the neck down, what does that body look like? Does that look like a 13-year-old body?
No.
Safe to say no. Yes. What this girl did was represent two sides of being molested. And she did it with a piece of paper, not knowing me at all, and saying to her, just draw a picture of a person. She drew a very sexualized head. She's got the lips, she's got the kind of sexualized eyes. And from the neck down, she's drawn, it isn't even really a person, because look at the hands. She's drawing a hand with four digits. She's drawing a little girl from the neck down. And you're going to see that a lot with kids that have been molested. They very often represented in their drawings, and it's very, very easy to do. But with her, what she was really trying to deny was the fact that she had been sexualized from the waist down, or from the neck down. And this, I think I showed you. If I didn't show you, I've shown this because I've had this picture for a long time. We didn't know that this little girl had been molested. She was in a foster home and she was acting up. And the foster mom referred her to us because she wanted us to essentially stop her from acting up, which isn't that what most foster parents want us to do? And so again, we have the therapist went in, and she had, you can buy these little things in Michael's. This was just a little cardboard cutout of, you can buy packages with cardboard cutouts of little boys and cardboard cutouts of little girls. And this was just a little boy. And she the little girl's name was Olivia. And she said, Olivia, I just want you to show me where you're angry. And Olivia drew all these circles because she was an angry little girl. And she drew this face. Now, what might you notice about that mouth? Does that look like a happy mouth? No, she drew a pretty angry little girl, and she had pigtails, so she drew the pigtails, and then she drew this. And every time I show this picture, I say, "What does this look like?" And nobody wants to say what this looks like, but it's pretty obvious what this looks like. Hold on a second. Hey, Daisy, I'm doing a training. Can I call you back? Okay, I'll call you back at the break. Okay, sorry, you guys. I gave you time to not say what this is.
It's a penis.
Thank you. Yes, it is. And that's how we knew that Olivia had been molested, because she drew a penis. Not only did she draw a penis, she drew a pretty accurate penis. And so the therapist said, well, Olivia, what is this? And she said, well, it's the thing between the man's legs, and it gets big and then milk comes out. So that was pretty clear. She scanned the picture to me. I scanned the picture to the hotline, and they took the report just based on the picture. This is probably 5 or 6 years old. And sometimes we don't always get to know the end of the stories. She had indeed been molested, and we were able to switch her treatment because now we knew what the situation was. And she ended up being adopted, to the best of my knowledge, successfully adopted. So at least it's good to have some stories have a happy ending. We're going to see all of this stuff when we're working with kids that have been molested. And again, we'll get into this more this afternoon. But one of the things that you absolutely see with kids that have been molested is this avoidance of, they don't want to be touched. They don't want you to hug them. They don't want you to touch them. They have triggers. And very often, if adoptive parents are not educated about those triggers, or foster parents aren't educated about those triggers, then they don't always know how to handle them. The key for you guys in working with adoption and sexual trauma is understanding that you can fix this. You can help adoptive parents to understand it. But if they don't understand it, it makes it worse, because they do things that make the situation worse. And this is a picture of a mother helping her husband rape her daughter. This is really just basically what happens with intergenerational incest, is that you often are going to find that the mother was molested. And if you look farther back, the grandmother was molested, because a lot of this is intergenerational. And when you are trying to find out who, if anybody, tried to help this child during the period in which they were molested, often find that the parents did not help. So because we're going to do more of this afternoon, I'm going to stop this at this point. I'm going to let you guys take a break. It's 10 after now. Why don't you guys come back at 20 after? Does that work? I'll take that as a yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, thanks.
Okay. Okay, you guys ready to come back?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to show you the other video that we have about rehoming. We do know the end of this story. This boy was rehomed. He did not end up in the foster home that rehomed him. And he's probably an adult now. I'm guessing this video is probably 10 years old, but it's definitely a phenomenon you need to be aware of.
Born in Liberia, Moses Gilbert was just 4.5 years old when he was adopted by Ian and Carol Johnson and brought to Canada. He was only 5 when they decided to rehome him to a woman they'd found on the internet. It was October 2006. Ian Johnson packed a suitcase, put Moses in the car, and drove from Castlegar across the border to Spokane, Washington. From there, they flew to a place that Moses had never heard of before, Houston, Texas, to meet a woman he'd never seen before at an airport hotel. Her name was Ambrosia Marvin, and she'd agreed to become Moses's new mother. 8 years after that meeting, it took us months to find Ambrosia Marvin, but we eventually tracked her to California, to the tiny town of Hemet. Are you Ambrosia Marvin? Reluctant at first, she finally agreed to meet us at a hotel. She told us she was a single mother in 2006, a part-time teacher who'd already raised 2 children from adoptions gone wrong. When she thought she'd like a 3rd child, she started looking at adoption sites online.
Last few weeks, as a single person, I didn't have the money to go to China or go to the former Soviet Union or go to Africa. And I thought, well, then maybe I could find a child on the rebound.
This
It
was on the
a
internet.
Yahoo group, just a Yahoo group. There were groups for everything under the sun, people who like classic cars, people who will fly airplanes, people who are interested in speaking Chinese. And there was a group for people who were looking to rehome their children after a disruption.
Do you remember what that initial post was, what it said?
5-year-old boy, adopted from Africa, families looking to rehome, situation is not working out.
She told us she and the Johnsons emailed back and forth for several months. It was clear to her the family was struggling, and given her experience, she was pretty confident she could help. And so that is how the deal to rehome Moses was eventually struck. Based on nothing more than that, no screening, no home study, no involvement by professionals or authorities of any kind, Moses and his father met Ambrosia at that airport hotel. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond is BC's children's advocate. The rehoming policy goes back decades, she says, designed to help families in crisis. Her concern, today it's being abused.
Rehoming is not a legal concept. Really, it is a new thing that has developed where people make private arrangements to transfer children from one caregiver to another. Those transfers happen outside the system of protection for children. So I have deep concerns about this because it might be a very fancy way, a very comforting way of saying trafficking in children.
Moses Gilbert's adoptive parents weren't trying to traffic him when they gave him to a woman in Texas. In their minds, they were just transferring custody. While the rules may be vague about that, there's one rule that's crystal clear. You can't take a child across the border with the intent of leaving him there without the authorities being involved.
The problem with one of the many problems with rehoming is exactly what you just see. This is a kid who ended up in a Texas foster home. He didn't know her. Eventually, she gave him up. And you can Google a boy named Moses and you probably can find, I don't think things ended well for him, but how could they? I mean, he was 4 years old when he was given back. He'd come from another country to begin with. Now he's being given back by the adoptive parents to somebody that they don't even know. He has now gone through 3 different countries trying to establish an identity. And you heard the woman from the foster care system say it is a fancy way to traffic kids. So just something to be aware of on a gloomy day. If you want to find out what happened to Moses, I think you can Google him. So we're gonna, where are we? Let me just go back to see where I am here. Treatment issues for kids who have been molested. Obviously, you're going to want to make sure that the main goal of your treatment is that children who've been molested know that this was not their fault. And it's very important to help your adoptive parents to give them that message. They may very well have poor boundaries. These are kids that don't always know what they should or shouldn't be doing sexually. And one of the things that we have to work with adoptive parents on is something called the sexual safety plan. And I don't think I've shown you that video yet, but I will. And it's a very prescribed way of trying to help parents to understand that they can help children reestablish boundaries just by modeling what normal family, mother, father, husband, wife do. These are often things that children who have been traumatized have not had much exposure to, and they don't know. If you've been raised in a household where there are no sexual boundaries, then you don't really know what are normal, healthy boundaries for men and women to do. And I'm going to move through that a little bit. When we're talking about treatment techniques, and we're going to do a little bit more with this today, as treatment professionals, if you haven't gone through the trauma-focused CPT training, I think it used to be free. Now I think it costs $35. You can Google it and do it online. It's a 10-module training. It's a really good overview for TFCPT. It used to be run by the University of South Carolina. But if you just Google it, it's been around for years. They updated all the videos a couple of years ago because some of the videos were getting a little dated, but it basically goes through the steps of doing trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. You can do it at your own pace. You can, once you sign in, if you want to do a module every Saturday morning, you can till you get it done. You have your own sign-in. And when we first started Circle of Friends, we used to pay people $100 to go through it and to prove that, give us their certificate. We haven't done that in a long time, but it is a very good overview for working with trauma. And it's a good overview for working with trauma and the role of the caregiver in the treatment of the child's trauma. So that's why we all use it. It's not the only thing you can use, but we use it because it's been around for a very long time. EMDR is a really, really good technique. Eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's a long title. EMDR is a super good way for those of you who have learned the technique to basically take the trauma memory that's imprinted back here where the child can't access it and get it here where that they can then say, oh, that's what happened to me. And that was then, and this is now, and I'm safe. Hypnosis is really the only thing in Florida you have to be certified in order to do it. EMDR training used to cost a whole lot of money. You used to have to go to 2 whole long weekends and then be supervised and go through all these groups. That's kind of gone away too. You can, generally speaking, get a good EMDR overview from the Green Tree Academy. It's usually 2 days. The one that I went to was 2 days. It's a technique, and it's a technique that is not that complicated to use, but it has really good results. Tapping is another really easy technique. If you're trying to get kids to kind of calm down and calm their sympathetic nervous system down and just kind of be able to focus with you, just bilateral tapping on left to right tapping with kids is a really good technique. Art therapy, I showed you the art therapy. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. And we're going to talk about sand tray, I think, next week. But play therapy and sand tray. Is there anybody here that has their own portable sand tray? Do you guys know how to use sand tray? I will take that as a no.
My colleagues and I have one in our office, and we have 2 portable ones that we can move into different offices with a bunch of different minis in on one of our walls.
Oh,
A miniature.
Good, 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 good. How have you found working with sand tray?
I don't work with sand tray as much as my colleagues do. I've actually only done it a handful of times because I've not been actively trained in sand tray therapy. They have been.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about sand tray, because I know that if you are a registered play therapist, registered RPTs are of the firm belief that you can't do anything unless you've been certified to do it. But these are just techniques. These are techniques and interventions that you can use, especially with children who've been molested, to get at what is going on with them without making them tell you the whole long story. And sand tray, I did a little sand tray training for a group of therapists from a group home, and they all left with portable sand tray kits. And one of the therapists got back to her office, and she had the sand tray on the floor and the sand tray kit sitting on it. And a little girl came in. She'd just been admitted. She was 9, and she came in and saw it and said, what is that, Miss Deb? And Miss Deb said, well, here's the bag. You want to play with it? And the kid proceeded, without even any intervention at all, to kind of lay out her molestation in the sand tray. And then she started talking about she kept saying the perpetrator is on the baby. And so now the therapist suddenly wakes up. She's sitting there typing. She looks around, looks down, sees that there's this whole thing going on in the sand tray, and tries to get the kid to talk about it. Now the kid's done. She's not talking about it. She's already done it. And she had not been admitted to the group home for any kind of issues of sexual molestation. As with many circumstances, she was admitted for her behaviors. And she subsequently had an outbreak of genital herpes and herpes of the mouth. And at that point, it was pretty clear that she had been molested. But I tell you that story because the therapist wasn't even paying attention to what she was doing. And the kid proceeded to do what kids are supposed to do with sand tray, which is to kind of build their story in the sand. So it's a great technique. We do a lot of training at Circle of Friends on the expressive therapies. So we do all of these. We do play therapy, we do biblio, art therapy, sand tray. For my therapists who are coming in beginning in June with your group supervision here in the office, we have a whole clinical library that Charmaine took a book out of the clinical library a couple of weeks ago, and I was thrilled because the clinical library has sat unused during the whole pandemic. And we have all of these books categorized in our library, and you are, as my Circle of Friends therapists, are very free to take them out and use them, because books like Some Secrets Hurt or Please Tell, Brave Bart, A Terrible Thing Happened, are really good books for being able to get kids to talk about what's happened to them. So any of these techniques are helpful. And what I want you to recognize is that other than TFCPT, none of this is talking. None of this is you sitting and saying, tell me what happened to your kid. These are all expressive therapies. And the reason we use them, especially with young children, is that it's much easier for kids to kind of show you what happened and be able to build a brave, safe new world for themselves than it is for them to sit down with you when they don't even know you and talk about what happened. For parents, what do we have to do for our parents? If you are a parent of a child who has been molested, you have to be comfortable with your own sexual skin. You've got to be comfortable with your marriage, You've got to be comfortable having your child talk about sex if they do, because sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. You have to be able to accept that history in your child. And you have to be able to discuss the child's history of sexual abuse. If kids sense that you as adoptive parents are uncomfortable with their history, what are they going to assume? Would they assume that you're ashamed of them? Yeah, they would. They would assume that you are ashamed, that you are uncomfortable with them, that you think they did something wrong. So one of the things that we have been able to do at Circle of Friends with the grants that we've been given is to open our parents up for services before the kids get there. And we were not able to do that before because we don't take Blue Cross and all of those. We take Medicaid. Well, parents don't usually have Medicaid. And we couldn't open up the parents with the child's Medicaid until the child was in the home. So one of the things that we were able to do with the grants was to do pre-adoptive work. And it's one of the things that we did was a lot of this, that you are adopting a child who comes from a very long history of molestation. Let's talk about how you're going to be with that. Let's talk about how comfortable you are. And when we get to the, I think it's this afternoon, I'm going to show you the sexual safety plan. It's a very prescribed way of sitting down with the child when they come into your home to say, you're safe here because nobody is going to have sex with you. And that is hard to get adoptive parents to do. And the other thing, and the reason I picked this picture out is because no matter what you do with this girl, she looks very seductive. She's a kid, she's a child, but you cannot desexualize a child. If they've been molested, if they have been exposed to sexual behaviors, we can't turn that around. It's always going to be there. It doesn't mean that you cannot then teach a child what they can do as children. That's part of our work with sexual trauma, is to kind of say, it's okay for you to not do this anymore. But it has to be verbalized. You've got, as adoptive parents, you've got to be comfortable enough to say, you don't have to do this in this house. I may have already told you this story. I don't know, because I do a lot of trainings and I get my stories mixed up. But one of our adoptive children, she was 10, and I think it was like her first night in the household. And the dad knocked on the door and said, "Are you decent?" And she said, "Yes." So he opened the door to come into her bedroom, and she was standing there naked. And so, of course, he was horrified and grabbed a towel and wrapped her up and said, what are you doing? And she said, "Well, you asked me if I was decent." And that's what my father used to say, "Are you decent?" before he came in to molest me. So this this turned out to be a fairly successful adoption, but this was a pretty put together guy. And he was able to sit down with her and say, you know, we don't have to do that here. And I don't expect that of you. And was able to really kind of start her healing on the first night in the home. Now, he could have freaked out, screamed, carried on, and then made her feel like she did something wrong. But he was pretty able to put that together. And we have to help them to differentiate between the child and their behavior, because when children do sexual things and they're very young, it's very disconcerting, isn't it? When you're looking at a 6-year-old that's humping their dolls, we don't expect to see that, but we do see it. One of the children, one of the youngest kids that came into the group home where I was working, he was 5. And he had been really, really badly sexualized by his parents. And he just had no idea what normal behavior was. He had no idea what a normal father did, what a normal mother did. His worldview was so skewed. And he was also very cute. He was little and blonde and very innocent looking. So when he would do these things, the group home parents would freak out and call the therapist. And putting his little blonde cuteness together with sexualized behavior was very disconcerting for them. So some of the work that we have to do, and you're going to have to do with adoptive parents, is just to help them to understand how to respond to those behaviors. And that's what we're going to do a little bit later on today.
I'm sorry, can I share a story?
Absolutely.
I had a client a few months ago who he and his younger sibling, he has a sister, they were very much neglected by their parents. And then it was suspected there might have been sexual abuse, but it was not confirmed, and both of the children denied that. But the problem with the reason that they thought that that was a factor was because the boy, and he is, I think he was like 13, he was aggressive sexually. So he was, at the time, he was living with his aunt, and they seem like they're a good family and stuff like that, but they were having a hard time with him because he didn't have any affection towards anybody else. Like they said, like, oh, he just doesn't care about anybody, none of us. He has like no empathy. He's just happy that we feed him, and other than that, he has no use for us. And then the aunt, she was like at her wit's end, and she was working with the case manager and things like that to try to find a placement for him, because she felt like he was going to be a liability to them sooner or later, because the school kept complaining that he's like overly sexual, and he was like kind of being he was exploiting other people, like the other girls. Like she said, he was caught, well, the girls told on him that he would like try to rub their thighs and just things that he shouldn't be doing, and he kept like touching people even though they would say, please stop doing that. He continued to do it. He would masturbate. Like they went to the doctor one time, and the aunt caught him about to masturbate when the doctor had her back turned away from him. So eventually they did find a placement for him, and it was out of state. And I think they even said that they specialize in treatment for children who are, I don't know how they described it, but they kind of were describing it like he's a perpetrator, like he's being a perpetrator. So I don't know, I just thought I'd share, but I'm hopeful that he did get treatment that might be able to help him, because the aunt had no clue what to do. I had no idea, because he's also manipulative. He would be manipulative kind of in the sessions too. Like he doesn't want to focus on it, and he'll tell you what you wanted to hear, but he's going to go back to school and continue the same behaviors, kind of.
So what do you know about his history?
It was very bad. So his mom, and it wasn't bad in the sense that very physically abusive, but there was a lot of neglect to the extent that they would be kind of the younger sister, she would be left in her crib for hours on end type of thing, and he would try to feed himself with whatever is around, which most of the time it wasn't really much. And because mom was pretty much always gone, and they would be left with like different people from time to time. So they didn't really have a lot of guidance or not much supervision at all. And he just doesn't really have much of attachment to anybody. He just doesn't care too much. He kind of just lives in his own world, but he likes to antagonize you. So if he knows that he's upsetting you, then he gets kind of happy about that. But in terms of like actually making friends and, building a bond with people, he didn't do a lot of that.
Well, Kamisha just described one of those situations where we all sit and say, well, what do I do now? Because it's really, really hard to work with children when you don't know what exactly has happened to them. But sexual acting out like that is, and I heard you kind of trying to figure out what to call him. In the
Mhm,
past, he would have been called a sex offender,
mhm.
without question, and that is not what we need to do. And I'm glad that you brought it up, Kamisha, because the second PowerPoint that I sent you out was understanding and dealing with kids' sexual behavioral problems. Many kids coming into the foster care system, especially when they've not been cared for, or they've been left alone, or they have been left to fend for themselves, can sell sexual favors because it gets them something. That doesn't make them a sex offender, but it does make them a survivor. And most kids who've had those experiences, you just described the perfect example of a kid with attachment issues because they've been given nothing. So if you've been given nothing, you don't expect to get anything. You certainly don't expect that your caregiver, in this case, the aunt, was going to do anything for you. And they are very hard cases to work with, and they're doubly hard. You're talking about a 13-year-old boy with sexualized behavioral problems. If he was 6, people would have had more sympathy for him because he was 13. He probably has been like this for a long time. He's probably learned that if he's antagonizing you, at least you're paying attention to him. And these are pretty negative lessons that some of our children learn. And they come into adoptive homes having learned those lessons very well. So hopefully wherever he is, he's getting some treatment. We can only hope. The difficulty is that there are many places that would consider him a sex offender. And there are very few kids who act out sexually as children that become sex offenders. That's a whole different problem. But there are kids who've been severely neglected and probably molested someplace along the line that develop those behaviors. And our job is to kind of help the caretakers deal with them. Not easy, as you saw. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
We rarely share our failures. We usually share the stuff we did that was great, but we all have times that we just don't know what to do. And it's difficult.
Oh, I had another question. I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of the time.
No, that's fine.
But the aunt, she also, which I don't know if, well, I'll explain her concern. She was very concerned that he was already acting out at school, but she was concerned that if he did something to a kid in the neighborhood, or if he kept on acting out at school and violated other kids, or that the parents would probably be upset with that naturally, and then like take further recourse. And she felt like she would be held responsible for his behavior. Is that was that a possibility, or was she overthinking it?
No,
I didn't know. Yeah.
no, she wasn't, because I mean, think of that possibility. And again, he's not 6, he's 13. So he goes to school, he does something to some girl, he touches her, she goes home, she tells her mother freaks out, her mother calls the police. The police are not, child-on-child sexual abuse is something that the police have a very difficult time dealing with. It's not that they don't want to help, but it's a very hard thing for them to deal with. So what the natural thing would be that the police report is made and law enforcement would come to her house and try to talk to the child, and she of course would feel blamed. So there's no good winners in those situations. Sometimes kids that have this level of inability to control their boundaries, to control their behaviors, often have really sexualized anxiety that creates these behaviors. And they do need specific treatment. But it's what Kamisha's kind of describing is a situation where treatment's going to get lost because the kid is going to do something to create a call to law enforcement. And then when law enforcement gets involved, their job is to prevent crime. So it gets to be a very complicated situation. We have a sexual trauma treatment team here at Circle of Friends. We have 4 or 5 of our therapists who specialize in that treatment. And this is really complicated stuff. You really have to kind of peel that onion to try to figure out where is this behavior coming from. And if you just start with the premise that this kid is not a sex offender, but something happened to him, or he wouldn't be acting out the way he is. So you can only hope that maybe he did get some help. But no, she probably wasn't wrong, because that's what ends up happening, that parents fear they're going to get blamed. And it's also one of the reasons why adoptive parents give back kids that have sexualized behaviors, because they, number one, don't know what to do with it, and number two, don't want to get blamed for it. So,
Can I share something?
yes, please.
I had a case where the two brothers were sexually molesting their sister. And when it came out, one boy was taken out and arrested, age 13, and the other boy was 11. The 13-year-old was doing it to the brother and sister. And then the 11-year-old did it to the sister after the brother was taken out. And then he was arrested too. They're both serving time in a detention center.
Where was this family, Deanna?
In Deltona.
Okay. Well, you know, and here's the sad thing, which is why the training we're going to do after lunch is a training that I do a lot, is that the schools and foster parents, adoptive parents don't have any frame of reference for treating this kind of behavior. Their only frame of reference is to call law enforcement. And once you call law enforcement, treatment stops. I mean, we don't know what happened to these boys. We don't know if it was intergenerational incest. We don't know if it was a situation where other people were molesting them and then they molested on down, because that's often what happens. When you get into some of these families, you see that it goes all over the food chain. But treatment usually stops when law enforcement comes in, because they're going to go down the path that they've been trained to go down in. So, and it's very unfortunate. I doubt these boys are getting any treatment where they are right now, because DJJ facilities really don't have a lot of treatment for this kind of behavior. So, and you know, we've seen over the years that kids, when especially boys, if boys have been molested and then they get older and they begin to replicate the behavior with the younger siblings, it's a learned familial pattern. And because treatment didn't happen at the other end, at the uncle's end, at the grandfather's end, at the father's end, as they got older and they began to molest on down. So, and we do get involved with those situations. I'm sorry that we do, but we do. What parenting skills do you need to teach your adoptive parents to deal with these things? Pretty simple stuff. When you have a child that's come into your home that has sexualized behaviors, it's usually because they have had, as Deanna described, as Kamisha described, have had no stability, have had no structure in their lives. So some of the things that we talk to adoptive parents about doing are kind of simple things. That everybody in the family has got roles. Everybody in the family has things that they have to do. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that the mother bakes the cake and the father comes home with his soup coat and he's doing all the work. But because this is a picture from the 50s and this is the way life looked in the 50s, it was much simpler then. But we are teaching our parents to just really enforce with kids that this is what we expect of you. We do not expect you to do any of these other sexualized behaviors. We don't want you to. It's not important. It's not necessary. We don't want you to do it anymore. And it doesn't have to be a lot of drama. It just has to be kind of reinforcing behavior. Because again, the reason I pick out this picture is because it is so simple. But when you adopt a child who's had what Kamisha's describing or Deanna's describing, they haven't had any of this. So they don't know any of this. And they don't know what you expect of them. Most kids coming into homes where they have spent a lot of time being sexualized are going to expect you as the adoptive parent to want that same thing from them. And that's why we do the sexual safety discussion. I'm going to move forward here a little bit. Have any of you, this video has been around forever. Do any of you know who this kid is? Most graduate programs show this video of this little girl. This little girl, her name was Beth, and she was the subject of a PBS documentary probably in the 90s. And she had been adopted by, I've got this video, she'd been adopted as a young child, but she had been molested from the age of 1 by her father, her biological father. And she was an extremely damaged kid. And she tried to kill her brother. She was only 5 when they started this PBS documentary. And it's hard to find it. You might find it on YouTube, but it's very, very dated because she's an adult now. And a lot of what they talk about in the video is, if you want to see what used to happen in the 90s that doesn't happen anymore, watch this video, because it was extremely dated treatment. They treated her as a reactive attachment child. They put her in a group home and tried to straighten out her sexual problems. And her parents gave her up, and she was then readopted by somebody else. And that person actually did a lot of, she went around lecturing about reactive attachment disorder. She had absolutely no background for this, but she ended up raising this girl. And it was just a perfect example of what not to do. But she talked in this, she's being interviewed. This is an interview with a psychologist who was talking to her about what she did. Why did she do some of the things that she did? Why did she want to kill her brother, who was younger than she was? And she just said, I was just hurt so bad, I don't want to be around people. And eventually, it's always hard to figure out what happened to Beth, but eventually she was able to receive treatment. And she is now probably in her 30s. She's a nurse, and obviously did have some recovery from this, but she's just a good example of what not to do in terms of treatment. In fact, I have this, now that I say that, I have this video, but I had to really find it on, I don't even know, I had to pay, it was out of print, out of date, and it's probably not on YouTube anymore, but it's just, I save it just because it's what not to do. I sent you this in your handout, and it's really just a good go-to for you to have, because it's usual and expected sexual development in children, and it kind of goes through, what do we expect these kids to do? This is normal sexual behavior. If you have kids preschool, like age 5 to 10, or pre-adolescent, adolescent, these are the things we expect them to do. These are not abnormal. And sometimes we have had to print this out for adoptive parents and say, okay, I know they're doing this, but this is not abnormal. This is what all kids are going to do something. All kids are going to have some kind of sexual behaviors. So there are, depending on how you were raised, there are some people that just don't seem to think the kids are going to do any of this stuff. Now, there's also the part where you say, okay, this is not just, they're not just playing with each other. They're, like Kamisha's describing, this is what you're describing with your 13-year-old is not normal sexual behavior. It is moving past that to do things to other people that they don't want done to them. But understanding what's normal is important. It's important for our adoptive parents. You'd be surprised how many people have been raised without any discussion about sex in their family. Depending on your culture, depending on your age, depending on the culture of your parents, there are some people that have been raised with very little of this. Okay, I think, hold on. I'm going to get out of this for a minute.
Can I just make a quick comment?
You absolutely can.
Back to the slide that you just had with when you broke down the appropriate levels of sexual development with, infants all the way through pre-adolescence. Because we work so much for me, I'll speak for me. I work so much with kids that come in through the foster system that have been sexually abused, but there's been a few of my younger kids that I've seen with the parents that are foster parents that are incredibly involved, and there was no history of sexual abuse, where the child was just displaying normal sexual development. He was, I think, 2 or 3. I'll give a case example. He was 2 or 3 years old and just very curious about his own genitals, not doing anything inappropriate to others. But they were so concerned, they were so overwhelmed, and I had to sit down and have a conversation just about normal sexual development. And oftentimes, I think when we're so focused on sexual trauma as therapists, we can forget to have those conversations with parents, and even with the kids that come in that say they don't have history of sexual abuse, but they have questions about sexual issues because they've heard about so many things that happen in the foster care system. So I think that chart there and having that conversation with parents and even with the older children is incredibly important. And I just thought I would chime in and say that.
No, I agree, Melissa. That's kind of why we put it up there. It's really, really hard for some, and again, depends on how you were raised. Yeah, when we do one of the trainings that I have, which is how did you learn about sex? There are very, very few people who learn about sex from their parents. We learn about sex from our friends, and our friends don't know any more than we do. So they don't tell us the right thing. Hold on a second. Okay, I'm sorry, you guys. That was the IT department, and it's so hard to get them to answer anything that I didn't want to let that phone call go. So I apologize for making you wait. So, and now I have no idea where I was because I completely lost my train of thought, but never mind. Okay, that is pretty much that for now. Let me see. Let's see if there's anything else that I wanted to show you before we break for lunch. Okay, since we have about 20 minutes, why don't we at least get started with this one? Because this kind of goes along with what a couple of you were talking about. I have 2 or 3 different trainings about sexual trauma. One is just on treatment of kids who have been molested. But increasingly, what we are seeing with kids coming into foster care is what Deanna is describing, what Kamisha is describing, are just kids that are responding to sexual behavior that has happened to them. And there's a whole lot more reactivity going on now than maybe I used to see. When I first developed the trainings on just working with sexual trauma, these kids were all clearly victims. They were kids that had been molested. They were kids that were going through all kinds of trauma reactions. But then we began to see kids who have learned how to react to their trauma. And sexual reactivity is not quite as sympathetic as sexual victimization. And it kind of goes along with one of you saying, well, is the aunt going to be blamed? Yeah, because that kid was reacting sexually. And it's not as sympathetic a situation as we sometimes have with kids that are just victimized. So when we talk about responding to kids' behaviors, and Melissa was talking about the chart, we have to understand that there's a difference between normal and abnormal behaviors in kids, because all kids act out sexually, all kids behave sexually. And usually if you quotes grow up in a normal household where one hopes that you are being raised by loving, caring parents, you are going to learn sexual boundaries at a young age. You are going to learn that you can't masturbate in the middle of Walmart. You're going to learn that your mom might say, honey, why don't you go in your bedroom if you're going to do that? Most sexually maltreated children just don't have any sense of healthy sexuality. They don't know what's right, what's appropriate. Sometimes they don't understand why we're mad at them for doing things like that. So we have to help kids understand the difference between normal and abnormal behaviors, and we have to help adoptive parents to understand that too. We're trying to keep kids safe, but our main goal in working with kids that have sexually reactive behaviors is to kind of turn those distorted thoughts around. We want them to learn healthy sexual behavior. And if they have not grown up in that circumstance, then that is not going to happen. For those of you who work in Volusia County, you probably are not going all the way up to Putnam. I realize that Putnam is quite a ride for you guys. But Putnam County is a very, very poor county. It's probably one of the poorest counties in Florida. And it's also a very I hope none of you are from Palatka or Putnam. It is a very rural, very kind of inbred kind of situation. And when we worked up in Putnam, this was a few years ago, almost every case that we got was an incest case. And it was very, very hard. Incest cases are very hard to work with because for one thing, it isn't just that a child has been molested. It is that they were typically molested by a family member. So not only did these kids, when we were trying to work with them, not understand family, they didn't understand normal behaviors in family. They didn't understand that the things that they had been subjected to or the things that they were doing to other people were wrong or and not considered correct in society. So they're very hard cases to work with. And if you have an incest case, you really need to get some good supervision around it because they're just very difficult. But our role with any of these kids is to try to give them a sense of what is normal sexuality, what is within the boundaries of normality. And you're going to find, like with the little guy, the little 5-year-old that I had at the group home, he had no idea what normal sexuality was. He just knew that he had been subjected to things and feelings that he didn't understand. And we did some very specific things with him because he didn't know what mothers did. He didn't know what fathers did. He only knew that they touched him in ways that made him confused. And we did a lot of work just trying to show him what normal families did. And we used, I think I may have said this before, we used the Berenstain Bears books, because if you read the Berenstain Bears books, they're all about a family. There's mama, papa, and brother and the sister, and they all do things and they all have roles. It's a very traditional kind of series, and the mothers do what mama Berenstain does one thing and papa does something else, and the brother and the sister do things together, and they go on vacations together, and they plan meals together, and they do things together, but what they don't do is have sex with each other. And we used some of that with him to just, because he was only 5, to try to teach him some of that stuff. You have to get creative. Sexual behavior problems, I want you to look at these. I found these when I was putting this together. These are 4 very common reactions that I found when reading things about this or talking to people about this, that these are common either reactions or misconceptions. Usually reports of children engaging in sexually abusive activities are blown out of proportion. They're really not. Adults need to expect some sexual play among children. Yeah, they do. You have to expect some normal sexual play. It is not normal to try to force yourself on another child. It is normal, which we've talked about before. If you look at 4th and 5th graders on the playground, what is their foreplay? Is chasing each other around. 4th and 5th graders get out on the playground and they just chase each other around. They never catch each other, but they chase each other. And that, in an odd way, is at that stage, that is what they consider a little bit of foreplay. They were excited about it. That's not abnormal. But it would be abnormal if a 4th grader threw a 3rd grader on the ground and pulled their pants down. So we have to expect some kind of sexual play among children. And this one, the majority of persons who have experienced child sexual abuse do not become adult sex offenders. This is a very misunderstood concept. And I find it among professionals too, that a lot of professionals expect children who engage in some kind of sexual activity to become adult sex offenders. And the research just does not support that. And there have been lots of research studies on this, and it does not support that. Many kids who are convicted or who are accused of some kind of sexual activity do not repeat it. They might repeat juvenile offense. They might repeat some kind of criminal activity, but they're not likely to become adult sex offenders. And that's kind of going back to Kamisha's kid, when you said that he was sent out of state and you were hoping that he got some kind of treatment. What very often happens with kids like this is that they, especially in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, we were calling everybody sex offenders then. And a lot of these kids were subjected to adult sex offender treatment. And that is not helpful for children. In fact, even, I can't think of, what is that facility in Orlando? Is it University Behavioral Center? When I first got here, they had a unit for treating childhood sex offenders, and they treated them as sex offenders. I don't believe that's there anymore, but the thinking at the time was that it was the same treatment for children as it was for adults, and it's not the same treatment. If you know anything about the treatment for adult sex offenders, it is based on group work. It's based on having empathy for your victim. It's based on apologizing to your victim and accepting your own guilt in this. And those are just not concepts that children can understand. So, and it also, if you're an adult sex offender, there's no doubt that you are the one that is at fault here. But if you're a child sex offender or a child who's reacting, usually it's because something has happened to you. So it's a different kind of treatment. And we can expect children who have been abused or neglected to engage in reactive behaviors towards others. We don't have to expect it, but it very often happens. That very often kids who have been abused and neglected do engage in reactive behaviors. And why is that? That is a self-defense mechanism. Especially boys are much more apt to act out than girls are. But we do see kids reacting.
Share a story that just recently happened that has to do with this. It was a former client.
Go ahead.
The child was, it was a little girl, 3 families living in one house, and the house was divided into sections. So when you go into the home, there was no living room. The kitchen was the main place, and there was a wall where the father, mother, and the 2 children were separated from everybody else. They put that wall up. I was going in and treating the other family. So I never really had contact but one time with, it was a recent case that in Deltona, the mother and father were arrested because the little girl acted out on the bus with her cousin. The bus driver reported it, and the sexual exploitation team came in and removed all the children. And from what I understand, they're trying to get the former clients to give up their rights.
Do we have that case, Deanna? Aren't there several siblings in that situation?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we have that case. That is what she's, if we're talking about the same case, there are several children. They're all very young, and they're all extremely sexually reactive with each other. And it has been extremely difficult to work with those kids. They did some of this when they were being removed in the police car in front of the policeman. Yeah, which really freaked out the poor policeman. So, and what she's describing is really extreme sexual trauma with very young kids who continue to act out sexually. Mercifully, we have a member, if we're talking about the same family, we have a member of our sexual treatment team that has some of those kids, and we staff that case pretty regularly. And fortunately, they have been sent to some really, really good homes where the care providers are very, very willing to work with these young children around not not jumping each other every time they get in she was trying to bathe them together, and the foster mom said, well, I'll never do that again. And you know, she's willing to learn that these are kids, that they're not bad kids, but they've been so sexualized that they don't know any better. They don't know the difference. And trying to teach very young children is harder than Kamisha's kid that's 13. You know, you at least have language when you're 13, and you have cognitive thinking when you're 13. These kids are little, and trying to explain that, yes, these feelings are pleasurable for you, but they're also confusing for you, and they confuse the people around you. So yeah, that was a very, very difficult case. Do you still have the other family?
No, they were removed. The thing is, the boy and girl that I worked with had so many behaviors, but never were alone with me long enough to tell me if anything was happening, but I knew something was going on.
Yeah.
But I couldn't just make assumptions.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I worked with, with him as best as I could with what I had. So when it all came out, I was like, I knew something was up, but.
Yeah, that's been one of the more severe cases that we've had in a while. We have had some really rough cases. That has been more severe in that the children are little. There's a lot of them. And they have just been so used to this that actually our assessor did the CBHA on it before we got it as a case. So I'm trying to read the CBHA, I'm trying to read the family history, and I finally had to stop and say, wait a minute, everybody in this family is sleeping with everybody else. It was just, there was nobody in the family that wasn't exposed to this. Uncles, grandparents, everybody. And then, of course, all these very young children. So the good news is that they do have foster caregivers that are very willing to do work that a lot of foster caregivers wouldn't do. I mean, that's kind of icky stuff for a lot of people.
It's comforting to know that they're in good homes, though, because.
Yeah, it is. In fact, when we got the referral kind of had some of the same information in it. And I'm sitting there reading the referral thinking, there cannot possibly be two of these families. Then I had to go find the CBHA again and go, wait a minute, this is the same family. Because I've done a lot of incest work in my time, and sometimes incest work kind of almost seems to load in certain areas. I worked in a very rural area in Massachusetts, and sometimes incest families tend to gravitate towards places where people aren't going to look at them. Sometimes rural, sometimes in homes where there's not a lot of people around. These tend to be isolated families. They don't tend to get involved in other activities because they don't want people to notice them. And they're very icky is the only word I can use. They're just icky cases to work with. And
well, they came from another state that they lived in a more rural.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure. I don't remember right at this moment what state they came from, but there are just it's like the sadness of Putnam. You know, Putnam is very rural. It's very poor. Some of these families have been intergenerational, and those are difficult cases. So, but yeah, they are in somewhat good hands. Let's put it that way. And they're young enough so that maybe people will still have sympathy for them, as opposed to Kamisha's 13-year-old that probably has had an equally difficult background, but because he is of the age that he is, he doesn't get as much sympathy. And I'm going to end with this slide, and we're going to take a break for lunch, but all that you've been talking about is what's on this slide. Just because kids have abnormal behaviors, it doesn't make them juvenile sex offenders. It doesn't make them child prostitutes. Kids who have been victims of sexual abuse are going to have some abnormal behaviors. And it's trying to help them to understand that they're abnormal, trying to help them is part of what our job is. But not everybody wants to do this work. So if you don't beat yourself up, because not everybody wants to do it. It's tough. Okay, it's 11:30. And I just wanted to kind of get that started for you guys before we break for lunch. Let me get out of this. Let me pause the recording. Okay. I just want you to see, again, other aspects of adoption. For people that are going through adoption, only 1/3 of those people made it through the process. And it is a long and sometimes very frustrating process. The thing that I find is encouraging is that a lot of the things that she was asking as a result of that study, which is probably 10 years old, are things that we are doing now. We are trying to prepare our pre-adoptive families for their kids before they get them, which we have found has been pretty critical to the success of adoptions. And getting support from other support services. We do the post-adoption support group now. We do pre-adoptive services. We do a lot of work post-adoption. And I hope with the folks from Enbridge coming in that you will begin to do some of that work as well, because there are really not a lot of agencies that do this work. And Enbridge and Circle of Friends, we all take the Medicaid insurances. We are able to provide those services, and you're going to find that if you really take some of what you're learning here and use it in working with your pre and post adoptive families, that you will be successful with them. And we have found that we have prevented several families from disrupting by getting in there, really kind of looking at what we know about how to work with adoptive families, staffing the cases together, saying, well, this didn't work, what else can we do? Some of it really does require like group effort. So we have our own adoption support or adoption group that we meet regularly to staff our cases. And it probably would be helpful for you guys to do the same thing. So, but you see that there's also issues on both sides. Staff feeling that there's not enough families. I don't think not enough families is ever the issue. I think families just get discouraged because it's a very long process. And if you're not familiar with ICPC, the Interstate Compact, that slows down. That's been around forever. And it's really just different if you're sending a child to a different state, or if there's a family from a different state that's going to adopt a child in Florida, those two states have to work together. I don't know why it is so long and cumbersome, but it has really been a problem for years. But okay, let's get back to the sexual trauma that we started out with. I thought I'd give you guys a little break from that for a bit. But I think when we're talking about kids that have sexually reactive behaviors, we have to remember that that does not make them sex offenders. And if you don't remember anything else from this training, from this particular PowerPoint, just remember that. We have had a tendency, maybe in years past, to not quite make that differentiation. But now I can tell you with Circle of Friends, we always open a case with the assumption that this child, if this child is reacting sexually, that this child has been exposed to some kind of sexual activity or some type of sexual abuse, and that it is a reaction. And almost always we find that that is the case. When Kamisha was sharing the story of her boy, which obviously she never got to the end of the story, it sounds like there was missing information that she had or didn't have in trying to work with this child. And that makes it frustrating for us as therapists. sometimes one has to just assume that kids do not wake up one day and say, I think I'll be a 10-year-old sex offender, that something has happened to that child. And that's what we're there to work on. So it is a very common misbelief that sexually reactive kids are destined to be adult sex offenders, and research does not support this, and our work doesn't support this. And if you believe that, then you're going to provide harmful treatment, and you don't want to harm. So believing that this child was started out as a victim and is now reacting to that victimization puts you in a much more compassionate position to be able to help a child. Yeah, and again, when I go back to Kamisha's case, 13-year-old boys are not anywhere near as sympathetic as 6-year-old girls. And that, unfortunately, is the way the world works. So the sooner we can get treatment started, the better off we are. Our kids have all these things. All of these things lead to sexual behavioral problems. Kids that are immature, that do not know how to relate socially, that have very low self-esteem, that have learned this behavior from something that's happened to them, or are sexually confused. Now, we are in a political climate right now in Florida, where we are being essentially not told, but kind of told, that we should not be discussing gender orientation or sexual identity, to the point where for the Circle of Friends people, before I went away in May, we held a roundtable for you guys to get together. Candace, I don't think, was with us then, and I'm not sure Kamisha was either. I think Danielle was with us, because Danielle sent me a very good position paper on that, and I thank you for that. But we got together to kind of determine what was going to be our stance as a clinical agency in providing needed service. And we certainly have taken the position that if a child comes to you and says that they are confused sexually, or they're not sure about their gender orientation, that yes, we are going to allow that discussion. But sometimes it is this confusion that also leads to some acting out behaviors. And kids don't always know that the things that they're doing are inappropriate. When you see a little kid humping dolls, or being seductive with other kids, or doing things that would be sexually inappropriate at any age, our kind of go-to thought is, what happened to this kid? And that really needs to be all of our go-to thoughts. What happened to this kid to cause this kid to be doing this? When Deanna mentioned the family that apparently we share, there were several young children, very young children in that family, that really did not have any idea that the things that they were doing were abnormal. And again, if you are dealing with incest, that you're far more apt to have that. If somebody drags you off into the bushes and rapes you, you know you've been hurt. But if it's your uncle, your father, your stepfather, your brother, and everybody is doing everything to everybody, it's hard to figure that out. So it's a very confusing thing. And again, sexually abused kids are often confused about their sexuality. It is very common for male victims of sexual abuse to automatically assume that they are gay. Now, it's all the more confusing now because there are so many sexual choices, if you will, that are being offered to kids that weren't there even 5 years ago. All the different vocabulary, the binary, the non-binary, the transgender, all of the different lesbian, queer questioning, all of those different options were not even there for kids to talk about a few years ago. But if you're working with a boy who has had a history of molestation, who is questioning their sexuality, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're gay, but it is a treatment issue that you have to be able to help them kind of tease that out to why do they think that, what's causing that, and helping them to get to the end of the story, whatever it may be. So what purpose does sexually abusive or problematic behavior serve? If you have a 13-year-old boy who is acting out in school, despite the fact that he knows he's going to get in trouble with the law, he knows he's going to get in trouble in school, he isn't able to stop himself. Kamisha said, if this kid thinks he's pissing you off, that makes him happy. A lot of the behaviors that she described with that boy are what we see right here. It's really, for some kids, acting out sexually is just a way to express the anger they feel, maybe the out of controlness that they feel, maybe they're ashamed. Most kids who are molested think that they caused it. So sexually reactive behavior may be a way to just express that this child feels really bad about themselves, so he is going to make other people feel bad about him as well. A lot of these kids are usually in kind of a perpetual state of heightened arousal and hyperactivity. And these behaviors are sometimes their attempt to relieve anxiety. I also would say that for boys, it's much harder to treat boys than it is to treat girls. And why is that? I always have had a saying about sexual trauma that boys steal cars and girls get pregnant. And all that means that if you're a sexually victimized child and you're a boy, you're much more apt to act out. If you're a girl, you're much more apt to turn that victimization on yourselves. So boys steal cars and girls get pregnant. That's just the way that is. Kids that have been molested have got to work it out some way. Most often they blame themselves. And getting a boy to admit that he has been victimized and that he has lost control and that something has happened to him to make him question his own sexuality or his own self-worth is really a hard thing to get to. I'm going to talk a little bit about child-on-child sexual abuse because it is a very misunderstood concept and it is a very misused thing. Now, I have presented this slide many, many times. And what I always say is if you work for a foster care agency, a state agency, another agency that says we always report child on child, regardless of the circumstances, then that's what you must do. Please hear me on that. What this slide says is what the law says. The law says, the statute says, in order for a child-on-child abuse report to be called in, you have to have three elements. You have to have a sense of coercion, you have to have age or size differential, and you have to have lack of consent. If you don't have those three things in a child-on-child situation, it is not necessary for you to call it in unless your agency dictates that you call it in. You always do what your agency tells you to do. For Circle of Friends purposes, we do not call in child-on-child abuse reports if these three things are not there. And why don't we? Because if it's two 6-year-olds that are doing something to each other that they shouldn't be doing, that is inappropriate sexual activity, there's no size differential, there's no age differential, there's no force, and there's no lack of consent. What there is are usually two children that have some kind of sexual abuse perpetrated on them. So what they need is treatment. They do not need law enforcement coming to them. Now, what happens with law enforcement, it's not that they don't care about it. And believe me, I did this training in Sarasota in March, and someone in the audience had worked for the Manatee Sheriff's Office, and she took great offense at me saying this. And she said, we do care about it. I said, I am not saying that law enforcement doesn't care about that issue. What I'm saying is that most of the time, they can't do anything about it. If it's a 6-year-old that has been perpetrated by a 16-year-old, forced, lack of consent, hurt, absolutely, that is a case where you would call child on child. But if it's 2 kids that are peers, that have both been molested, that are acting out on each other, that's our job to take care of that. So don't send me nasty emails like the woman from the Manatee Sheriff's Office. I did not say that she didn't care about it. I just said that that's not something that they can do. Consent is T. You've probably seen this. It's on the internet, but it just talks about what consent is.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they go, oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you. Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no, thank you, then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, yes, please, that's kind of you. And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, do you want tea? Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, but you wanted tea last night. But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
You can find that on the internet. It's on YouTube. If you're going to Google consent is tea, there's consent is tea clean and consent is tea not clean. And obviously I use consent is tea clean for training purposes, but it's the same thing. I think there's just some swear words in the other one. But it does explain consent. Child on child abuse, what to do. If there are 2 6-year-olds playing doctor, that is not child on child abuse. But if a 12-year-old is going to force a 3-year-old to perform oral sex, that is child on child abuse. Now, having said all that, if a 15-year-old is going to coerce a 5-year-old, that is child on child. The thing that you have to remember, whatever the circumstances, is that there are very, very few circumstances where the older child coercing the younger child has not already had something happen to him. And that, if the older child is your client, that is where you start to try to determine what the history is. by trying to determine what exactly happened to this older child to create the circumstance that he now finds himself in. And when I say, what does this picture look like? What does this picture look like? Are these kids the same size?
No.
No. And what else do you notice about this picture?
His hand is on his neck.
Right, his hand is on his neck, and the younger child looks what?
Afraid or fearful.
Yeah. When you look at something like this, you look at something and you say, okay, this looks like I probably do need to take some kind of action. I always just want you, whatever, I don't know what Emika's take is on this, but for our purposes, before we get anything in motion that is going to exacerbate an already difficult situation, we take a look at what's happening here and what do we really need to do, because our focus is treatment. And yes, there are times, and there are going to be times, that older children perpetrating crimes on younger children need to be dealt with. You can't just let older kids perpetrate crimes on younger kids or perpetrate crimes against the force and will of a younger child. But our purposes are always treatment focused. So we're always trying to look at what do we need to do to take care of the needs of the child that we are working with. Most of the time, these situations are not going to require law enforcement. If it does require law enforcement, then we need to be able to prepare the family for it to happen. We have had many, many circumstances, and a lot of them are adoptions, where an older child perpetrates on a younger child, and the police are involved, and the parents are kind of given the choice to move the older child out of the house while this is being sorted out. Well, very, very often we get the older child moved out of the house, and maybe with a grandmother or with an uncle or in a foster home, and that child is feeling ostracized and blamed. And very often the younger child is missing their sibling. So they're complicated cases. They require a lot of group supervision and discussion about what's the best way to go to get out at the end of the situation. Have we resolved the situation that got everybody into it? And have we helped the child that has perpetrated the crime? Complicated, lots of layers. This is what is a sexually reactive youth versus a youthful sex offender. And I believe this is the one that has the discussion about the research in it.
I'm not a monster. I'm a person that made mistakes. I was a child. And I didn't even know what I was doing.
We all want to protect children. Listing juveniles on the public sex offender registry doesn't protect anyone. Putting their name and their faces and their address on the public registry devastates entire families.
We were playing with dolls, and the dolls were kissing, then we were kissing, and then it led to little fondling, you know, over the clothes, under the clothes. That was it, but obviously that was enough to convict. I was 12 and she was 8. I was during the summer, and I, experimented and did some things that shouldn't have done, but I didn't know. I didn't know the consequences. I thought something like this came with a grounding or a spanking. I was still that young. I've spent maybe close to 8 years behind bars. I was young, right? When you hear sex offender, you don't think it's a 12-year-old little boy that's crying himself to sleep in a juvenile cell.
Most people think if you're on a registry, you're definitely dangerous. And so, but it's really, the real fact about it is that there's a broad range of offenses that can place a person, or especially a child, on the registry.
Where's your sons?
We all want to keep our children safe. The problem is that the laws are based on faulty assumptions. They're based on the assumption that children and adolescents who commit sex offenses are at high risk to commit more sex offenses. This isn't true. There are many studies, there's been over 30 that show low recidivism rates for youth who have sexually offended. That's the main point of registration and notification, is to reduce sexual recidivism. And that does not work.
I was a child. I was misunderstood. I did something wrong. Yes. Punish me and punish me appropriately, but don't throw me into a den of lions.
And I can understand paying some sort of price for doing something that wasn't right, but absolutely not have them put on the public registry and to have their names in all of the local newspapers and then expect them to go to school and mingle with the other kids.
The police will publish your information on the official website. In some states, they'll make mailers, they'll make flyers. Sometimes it's lawn signs saying sex offender lives here.
And all the neighbors were handed out pamphlets describing my sons in the house and where the sex offenders live. Vigilante groups coming to my house, the Molotov cocktail thrown at the house. The holes are still there around my bedroom window where the BBs went through the vinyl siding on the house. They were 11 and 13 years old.
A person on the registry, even if it's a person that's 11 years old, 12 years old, 13 years old, cannot enter or live in zones that are frequented by children, meaning a park, a daycare, a nursery, a school.
I found it hard to, find a place to live. It's been difficult to keep jobs. I dropped out of college because of the registry. The registry also directly affects my own children, my wife. We have moved 9 different times within the past 3 years. They've been in 4 or 5 different schools. And that makes me feel like a horrible parent because I can't give my children what they need.
No matter how hard they're trying right now in their lives to get their lives together, it's never going to go away. You just Google up their names and up comes all the sex offender information. For what happened when they were 10 and 12 years old is turning out to be a life sentence.
This person has this label for the rest of their life based on something that they did when they were a child.
Juveniles should not be subjected to registration or notification. In the absence of any supportive evidence whatsoever that there's a community safety effect, youth should be protected from these laws.
I don't believe now that Florida does that to the extent, this was Texas, to the extent that it was done in Texas. However, to be considered a juvenile sex offender in Florida, at least the last time I checked the statute, you had to be 13 or older and you had to have been convicted of a crime. You couldn't just be accused of a crime. You had to be convicted of a crime. But as you saw in this, the ramifications are lifelong, and you don't, which again, when you're thinking, is this child on child? Do I go ahead and report this? I would just say get some good supervision around it, look at all sides of it, and determine what are you going to accomplish with this? And in some cases, there's definitely crimes that have been committed and need to be addressed. And in some cases, it is strictly a treatment issue, and we are the treating providers. So it's not an easy issue. It's really something that our sexual trauma team, when we sit and go over some of these cases, we have to kind of sort out all the different layers and then say, well, where do we want to go from here? What are we trying to get to? We certainly have got to work within the law. Please hear me on that. Don't be sending me cards and letters like the lady from Manatee. But we work within the law. We do what the law says, but we have to make sure that what we are doing is not an overreaction, because our thinking about this in the clinical community has changed a whole lot in the last 10 years. I want you to just look at some of these things, and I'm more than willing to have you turn off your mic and tell me what you think about this, because these are all situations that have happened and have happened either with me in treatment or with my therapist. And there have been reactions sometimes that were helpful and reactions that sometimes were not helpful. And it's what I said, these are very triggering situations. Your 14-year-old foster son was severely molested by his father and uncle for years. He's in treatment. He's making very good progress, but he goes to a therapy session and comes home and manipulates your 3-year-old daughter behind the couch where he fondles her. Now, for those of you, and you're all therapists, I know that sometimes people bring up stuff in therapy sessions when the 15-minute hour is now over, or they're telling you something when they're walking out the door, or you haven't had a chance to kind of put them back together at the end of the therapy session. But that is basically what happened here, is that it was a fairly inexperienced therapist. She got this boy to talk quite a bit in the session about what had happened here, what had happened in his life, and the fact that everyone who molested him was an older man. He was a young man, now a 14-year-old, and feeling like he should have controlled this. Why couldn't he have controlled it? And in fact, he was quite young when this started. But he left the therapy session and he was kind of undone. He was a little bit raw. And actually, we had some good conversation after this, because we have to put our clients back together before we send them back out into the world. And he came home. He was in a foster home, and the foster mom is sitting, she's in the kitchen, she's making dinner. The 3-year-old is sitting on the floor watching television, and the kid just got behind the couch and just got her to come over, and he just rubbed her vagina a few times over the clothes, and then he lifted under her underpants and he rubbed her a few times. And then she came out, and when the mother looked up again, the kid is still sitting watching television. So it was a situation where he was reacting. But the little girl did finally say, you know, so-and-so did this to me. And they, of course, got dreadfully upset and came over to talk to me about it. But what we ended up doing, now, obviously, this is a 14-year-old, this is a 3-year-old. We had that whole situation at the time. It was a group home situation, that what do we do and how do we handle it? And the group home, at this particular group home, the rule was that we always called. So we did call, because that was the rule. And the law enforcement officer that came out was fortunately a pretty well-grounded law enforcement officer. And he kind of said, as I have heard law enforcement say before, I think this is really a treatment issue more than a me issue. There would have been nothing to gain by doing anything with this 14-year-old, because in sitting with him and his therapist, he did say that he just got really riled when he left and began thinking about all the things that happened to him, and in effect was kind of working it out with the little girl and recognized that he shouldn't have done it. And we actually got some therapeutic oomph out of this. The opposite might have been true if a law enforcement officer had come out and said, okay, well, I really need to take action here. I really need to arrest this kid. There's a lot of things for law enforcement to consider when they react to a child-on-child call, and there's a lot for us as therapists to consider. In this particular situation, because I followed the story for a while, the boy actually was able to verbalize what happened, was able to essentially say to the foster parents, I'm really sorry, and I would not do this again, although God knows when you're 14, you can do anything again. But we did get a little bit of therapeutic progress out of it, only because we all had to sit and say, what has to happen here? What's our greater good? The little girl wasn't hurt. She did recognize that something weird had happened, and it was good that her mother said, yes, that was weird, and he shouldn't have done it. And if it ever happens again with anybody else, you need to tell mommy, and it wasn't your fault. She was fine. The boy made some therapeutic gains from it. Never easy ones to call. Second one, Second one also happened to one of our clients. Had a 10-year-old foster daughter. She had been rented out as a prostitute by her father to several uncles in the family. From the time she was 6, she was now 10. She was in foster care. And she sat down one night next to the foster dad and asked him to read her a story. And so he begins to read her the story, and she begins to stroke his leg. And then suddenly she reaches down and she touches his genital area. Well-trained foster parents rarely react as calmly as this guy did, but he was able to move her hand, to move her away, to guide her away, to say to her, I am not asking you to do that. Help me to understand why you're doing it. And she said, because that's what my uncles liked. Getting your foster or adoptive parents to react calmly to situations like this and not get all upset is really, really difficult for a lot of people. This was just a pretty mature guy. He was able to say, yeah, you know, honey, I don't really need you to do that. I don't want you to do that. And was able to sit down with the therapist and the little girl, and they talked about it together. And she was able to learn that not all men want that. But what would have happened had he gotten really upset with her and acted like she had done something wrong? How would that outcome have been very different?
She could have been embarrassed and ashamed and felt like there was something wrong with her.
Yeah, right. Exactly. You know, these are, thank you, Farah. These are very awkward situations for foster or adoptive parents. They're always awkward for the foster fathers or for the adoptive fathers. And we always try to say to the fathers, especially if you are adopting a child who has had any kind of sexual trauma, these are some of the reactions you might get. And this is what is best for you to do, for you to redirect the activity, for you to reassure the child that you're not angry, that they are not bad, and that is not something that you want them to do. It's all part of re-educating children that have been sexualized in aberrant ways. But I got to tell you, it takes some pretty mature foster dads to do that. Your 16-year-old foster daughter has been molested both by her father and her stepfather, but she's been in your home and she's been a model child. And one Saturday you are house cleaning together and you ask her if she would like a bologna sandwich for lunch. And she flies into a rage and she tries to choke you. And you believe that something triggered this behavior because all you did was ask her if she wanted a bologna sandwich, but you don't know what the trigger is. Now, again, when you have really good, stable foster or adoptive parents, they can be so helpful in re-educating and redirecting and redefining normal sexual behavior. But these things come out of the blue. And unless you've worked with your families around kind of, you know, what if this happens and how are you going to handle this? These are hard things to do. In this situation, this happened on a Saturday. Now, who's around on a Saturday to help foster parents? Just about nobody. Even the person on call has already discontinued or turned off their call. But these particular foster parents were just very, very stable. And because this kid had been so calm, they knew that something had happened. So once she calmed down, they all sat down and talked about it. And she was able to say, every time my father or my stepfather wanted to do something, the signal was, would you like a bologna sandwich? There's no way that this foster mother would have known that. And she was just offering her lunch. But she did recognize that the ferocity of the behavior really caused this kid to fly into a rage. It also helped the girl to understand that this was a trigger for her, and understanding triggers is part of treatment, because you may always have triggers, but you need to learn how to deal with them. And the last one, I leave it in here because it happened quite a long time ago, but this happened at a group home. And I had not lived in Florida for very long, but there were 3 unrelated girls in this home. They were all between the ages of 13 and 15, and they all had a history of molestation. And one night, the foster mother walked into the bedroom and found them all engaged in sexual activity. Now, you know how I said that we have changed a lot of our safety protocols in group homes and cottages now? At the time, this cottage was constructed so that there was 2 girls in one bedroom and 2 girls in one bedroom, and then they had an adjoining bathroom. So the cottages in most group homes have been rebuilt to address what we now know about the proclivity or the propensity for kids in foster care to have been molested. But she found them all engaged in sexual activity with each other. And the 2 younger kids blamed the older girl, and the older girl said that the younger kids consented. And the foster mom, just this particular foster mother, was beside herself. So I came into the cottage and found her sitting on the porch. And she told me what happened and said, I handled it really badly. I didn't know what to do. And again, to be fair, to place this into the context of 15 years ago, I don't know that a lot of foster parents received a lot of training in how to handle this kind of thing. And so I went in and ended up separating all the kids and talking to them all individually. And learned, to my great surprise, that they were all in congregate care. They were all in group care. They had all been privately placed in congregate care by relatives, and none of them had disclosed their history of sexual trauma. None of them had received any treatment for sexual trauma. They were all there because their relatives essentially said they were bad kids and they didn't want to take care of them anymore. So the only good side, well, the one good side to this story is that it was the beginning of treatment for a lot of these kids. They hadn't told anybody what had happened to them. They were going through puberty, and they had received little care in their family of origin. They all had undisclosed histories of sexual trauma. They had never received any treatment for it. And the outcome of this was that they were just all acting out on each other. So as I recall, because again, this was quite a while ago, it was the policy of this group home to call law enforcement. And so I called law enforcement, and the officer who arrived said the same thing that the other one did. This is a treatment issue. We have nobody to arrest here. One thing you need to know, if you do call in a child-on-child report, that no one in the report is named as the perpetrator. And the reports are not made or filed as abuse reports. They are filed as reports, so there is a record on them in case something else happens. But it's not a case where, in this case, the 15-year-old girl would have been named as the perpetrator. They don't handle them that way. But I do well remember this law enforcement officer saying, there are no perpetrators here. There's all victims. So it's a treatment issue. They like saying that it's a treatment issue, so it's up to you to take care of it. And we did, but they can be complicated situations. We certainly learn, and I try to say this to adoptive parents, if they get into these situations, that we're all human. You know, we all react to these situations emotionally, and we all always have to try to say to adoptive parents, your kids may act out sexually because that's what they have learned. And now part of your job is reteaching them normal sexuality, normal behavior with each other, teaching them what you as parents are supposed to do and what they as children are supposed to do. Some behaviors are more concerning than others. Some behaviors absolutely warrant treatment facilities. Some warrant treating professionals. Some may warrant law enforcement intervention. But the best antidote for all of this is calm, supportive, caring adoptive parents. So if you didn't think you had to teach your adoptive parents how to deal with sexually traumatic situations, you do, especially if they've had background, if they're adopting kids that have come out of the system. I always tell adoptive parents that this is no time for you to get hysterical, but please call for help. Before you do anything, I would rather that you put the child in the bedroom with a good video to watch while you calm down and maybe called your therapist and said, okay, I'm not sure what I should do. We know that we don't act out in anger or in upset with our children. It's not the best thing to do with your own children. It's not the best thing to do with foster kids or with adoptive kids. So we always try to tell adoptive parents, just calm down, reassure the child that he or she is not bad because he has done something like this or she has done something, and consult your therapist or whoever you have to talk to. I think this is probably going to be the last thing I'm going to show you. When I talked about the sexual safety plan, the sexual safety plan was developed by Dr. Wayne Dean of the University of Arlington in Texas. And he developed this into a very prescribed way to do things. And for a while, he's now 84 years old, but for a while, he was coming to Florida. Different agencies were consulting with him and having him do a lot of training on working with sexually abused children. And one of the things that he developed was the sexual safety plan. And he used to demonstrate it at the trainings. He used to have people role play in the roles. He would have somebody be the adoptive mother, the adoptive father, the child, and he would set up the scenario and they would do the sexual safety plan. So we put it on our YouTube channel. This is me, but I always want to give him credit because he's done a lot of good work over the years for kids with sexual trauma. Hello, my name is Barbara DeFazio, and I'm Vice President of Outpatient Mental Health Services for Circle of Friends Services. Circle of Friends Services is a division of Florida United Methodist Children's Home, and we opened in 2009 to specialize in the treatment of children and families in traumatic situations. And in recent years, we have begun to do some work with adoptive families to help adoptive families and children with the kind of normal and predictable crises that sometimes happen in the beginning stages of adoption. So today we're going to talk a little bit about adopting the child with sexual abuse trauma in their background. So you get the call from the matching department and they tell you that they have a match for you and you're very excited because you as adoptive parents have been waiting for this match for a very long time. So you go to the meeting and the worker says, we have a child for you. She's 6 years old, but she has a history of sexual abuse. And you shrug and say, we can handle that because you believe that you can. So you bring your little girl home. And on the very first night that that child is in your home, the adventure begins. And you might start out by coming into the living room and finding this little girl masturbating in front of everybody. Or you might find that she crawls up on your husband's leg and starts to stroke your husband. And you are horrified because you have no idea what to do. And didn't the worker tell you that this child had had trauma treatment for her sexual abuse? That's probably true. But children who have been molested have been exposed to a very natural process in a very unnatural way. And placed in new situations, they often do not know what to do. And they don't know what you expect from them. So you get some of these behaviors, not because these are terrible children, but because they don't really know what else to do. So I always tell the story of one of my adoptive fathers who brought his 10-year-old daughter home. And on the very first night in their home, he knocked on her door and said, "Are you decent?" And she said, "Yes." So he opened the door and found her standing there completely naked. And he was horrified and he rushed over with a blanket to cover her up. And he said, "Honey, I asked you if you were decent. Why did you say yes?" And she said, "Because when my dad wanted to have sex with me, that's what he said. He said, 'Are you decent?'" So what did this adoptive father do? He sat down with this little girl and he began her healing that very night. He did what we call the sexual safety plan. And the sexual safety plan is just this. It is sitting with a child on the very first night in your home and helping that child understand what the rules of your house are. So how do you start with this? You're going to start with the easy stuff. You're going to start by saying, "Now, honey, in this family, if you need to get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, just do it. If you need to get a drink of water, that's okay. If you want a snack before dinner, after dinner, just ask mom or dad and we'll make the decision, because some foods you can take in the living room and some foods you can't." So that's the easy stuff. Now we're going to get into what we call the sexual safety plan. And we let you start with the easy stuff to kind of get you warmed up for it. So you're going to say, "In this house, if you want to go to the bathroom, nobody is going to go into the bathroom with you. And in this house, if you want to change your clothes or get up and get dressed in the morning, you can shut your door and nobody's going to bother you. And in this house, nobody is going to ask you to touch them, and we are not going to touch you in ways that make you feel uncomfortable. In this house, nobody is going to ask you to do anything sexual ever. And in this house, mom and dad are the only ones that have sex. And we have sex because we're married, and we have sex behind closed doors. So in this house, we want to keep you safe, and we want to make sure that you tell us if anything ever happens to make you feel uncomfortable. And we will take care of it because we are your parents, and that is our job. Now, is this awkward? Yes, it is very awkward for parents to do, but we will help you get used to doing it. We will help you practice it. And I guarantee you that if you do it, you will cut down on a lot of the sexual gestures that little kids have, cut down a lot of the questions that they have about what you expect from them. You will be able to help your sexually abused adoptive child heal. And you will do it in a way that will help them to get better and help you to form a very natural and loving family. So don't be afraid of this. Your adoptive child is worth it. I hope that this has been helpful to you as part of our series of helping adoptive parents understand how to take care of their newly formed family. Thank you. As you can see, our production director gets a little crazy with the music at the end of that stuff. So let me unshare the screen because that is the end of that presentation. A couple of things as we're trying to kind of put everything into these 5 days that you have. We talk about adoption, we talk about the core issues of adoption, we talk about how you're going to work with these families around adoption, but you have to understand attachment, which is why we did the whole presentation on attachment last week. Many times, you're going to have to understand sexually traumatic behaviors. As we always looking to add to this training, I think that we're going to have to add a presentation about kids that have been born substance exposed, because there's certain behaviors that happen with kids that have been born substance exposed. And in this current crisis, opioid crisis of the last 8, 9, 10 years, we have very few kids that have come in that haven't had some kind of exposure to that. But for you guys right now, I want you to just understand basically what the issues of adoption are, some specific things about what you can do as part of the treatment, understanding the issues that some of these kids have gone through, And next week, we probably will wrap up a lot of this. We're going to talk a little bit more about treatment, some of the things that you can do for treatment. Anything that you want to add is always welcome. It's much easier than it is for me. And I can tell you it's 1:30 and we're done. We're done because when you do these things on Zoom, we don't get the same level of participation because people have gotten very used to Zoom. And when we do the trainings in person, I think you get a whole lot more. I think you got some good sharing from some of your people here today about things that had happened to their cases. And those things are really a lot more important for you to hear than some of the theory that I'm trying to present to you, which is also why we do so much with videos, just because there's only so much theory that somebody's brain can suck in one day. And people have a tendency to be able to either sit and listen to somebody else or to watch a video and say, oh, that's what that was all about. So does anybody have anything that they want to add today? Is there anything that was helpful, not helpful? Are you beginning to see what I'm trying to get at with you with this whole way of dealing with these families? Because I hope you are.
Yes.
I have a quick question. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna make a quick comment, but go ahead with your question.
I had a question regarding, you had mentioned the case with the boy that was in counseling for his sexual abuse and then going back and perpetrating on a younger girl. You mentioned before the session is up, kind of putting them back together. I'm a newer counselor, so I just have, like, I'm wondering how you would suggest doing that, if you have like a certain method or technique, or just expound on that, please.
Well, I'd love to hear what the rest of you have to say. But here's what I'm going to say, Farah. When I had my private practice, I always had the clock on the wall facing me. Whatever chair I was sitting in, I could always see the clock on the wall. Because when you're doing a therapy session with a kid, you have about 20 minutes in the middle that you got your work cut out for you. You have about 20 minutes of trying to get them to talk to you. You got that 20 minutes in the middle, and then you get that last 10 minutes or so where you're trying to put them back together again. And by putting them back together again, I mean, say you're doing a play activity. Maybe you're doing sand tray, maybe you're doing Jenga or whatever. And they have that time in the middle that maybe they're going to start to talk to you a little bit. You got to kind of bring them out of it a little at the end by, kind of lightening the mood, lightening the tone, maybe kind of starting to talk about other things. Because think about your own brain. You got to kind of settle down a little bit. You're seeing these kids in school. We can't put them through all that and then say, okay, kid, go back to geography. They have to be able to make a little transition. And sometimes we might do it, like if we're here in the playroom, we might do it by, they've been doing a puppet show and they've really been kind of acting out whatever has happened to them. We might switch the play to have something more lighthearted. Now let's have the puppets do a dance together. Or we're playing with the kitchen. Let's make some dinner together now. We've talked about some of the stuff that had happened. Now let's maybe make some dinner together now, or just something to kind of transition them. Let them calm down, let them stop kind of focusing on even kids that are not talking to you. If they're doing it in a sand tray or they're doing it in a role play, they're there. So you're kind of trying to get them kind of eased out. Maybe the play becomes lighter. Maybe the sand tray, you say, let's do a really funny story now. And it just kind of resets them a little. Does anybody else have any tools for that? Stuff that you do to kind of bring your kids to a point where you can send them back to geography, so to speak?
I do. I have a set that has little pictures on it. And what I'll do is I'll have help the child to make up the story and do it with them. A fun story about maybe going and looking over into the water and looking at the fish swim around and just make it fun.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what I mean. It's just, you're just kind of bringing them back to the real world. Charmaine, what did you want to say?
I was just gonna say, also I wanted to say, sometimes I do use a book. You
Mhm.
know, the books have been really helpful just to put things into perspective and to give them like ideas of things to do and to get themselves to the place where they're good to go.
Yeah.
But no, I was gonna say, this has been really helpful because learning about, oh gosh, now I'm having a brain fart, where they, in essence, give a child away. I couldn't fathom that happening, or for me, I'm just saying for me, but and it be okay. Like I had no idea at all. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn about that and to be able to experience this training, to find out the details of, you know, how to proceed now. And knowing this information will definitely help with that factor.
Well, I'd rather you get exposed to it now than be sitting in the middle of a therapy session and have somebody say, you know what, I think I'm going to rehome my kid tomorrow. They're really, really hard things to deal with. A few years ago, when I was the acting vice president at FUMSH, at Children's Home, and I got there and the place was full of failed adoptions. And it was really, really hard to have sympathy for those parents. I'm a pretty empathetic person, but I had to work at that because most of them had really not put the work in to make the adoption work, and then kind of left the child over there and would say, well, I want him to have a good home until he's 18. Well, what's going to happen when he's 18? He's not ready to be out on his own. But it is hard to understand that whole concept of dissolution or rehoming or just giving your kid back. And mostly, so I understand, because now 3 of you have said the same thing about the rehoming. Sometimes parents are not prepared. Maybe we haven't prepared them. Maybe the department hasn't prepared them. The adoption unit hasn't prepared them. And then they don't get supported. And if they don't get supported in the initial stages of adoption, they can give up pretty easily. And we don't want that to happen. So when you look at those kids in that video, I mean, what chance did those kids have after they had been given back and then rehomed and then molested? Your chances for success diminish with each thing that happens like that. So yeah, I mean, the adoption competency when it first started was a very dry 5 days. And we really had to look at what do people need to know in order to work with adoptions. You have to understand attachment. You do have to understand the effects of trauma, sexual trauma, abuse, neglect on kids. You have to understand things that you might not have thought you needed to learn about. Infertility. What is the effect on a couple when they cannot have a baby? And some of the things that you see in the entertainment industry now also kind of boggle my mind. This whole idea of hiring a surrogate because you don't want to ruin your figure to get pregnant, and then you have a baby through surrogacy and you're complaining to the world that you're not bonded with that baby. Well, you're not bonded with that baby. There's a lot that we try to put into this training that will help you to just understand all sides of it so that you can work and can be sympathetic to these parents when they start to think that they're failing. You already know how to work with kids. You're all good at working with kids. You know how to work with trauma. You know how to do all that stuff. Farah, you will learn how to do all that stuff. We all had to start someplace. but this is a much bigger picture here of working with an entire family with all of their different cogs in their wheel and try to put them all together. So that's why I think that we do the refreshers. We're going to do one in July. It's called Helping Families in the Critical Post-Adoption Period. It's just a one morning training, but it's kind of a refresher on all of the things that we talk about, all of the things that our therapists talk about, because we talk about this stuff all the time. But then we try to get together maybe once a year and just do the refresher. And actually, if Melissa is still on, Melissa, that's what I was going to suggest for you. That I believe, I'll have to send you the flyer, but I believe that we're going to do that on July 14th. And I think the last time somebody had missed one day, that's how I made it up. It's enough to kind of get, just kind of pull it all together. So, and any of the rest of you are more than welcome to come if you want to come. It's July 14th, it's 9 to 12. And I can send any of you the flyer. So anybody else have anything? Gay, I hope you were able to get on. I know that this poor girl has really had terrible internet laptop problems. So I hope you were able to at least make it on with your phone. So
I just wanted to maybe, I'm not sure, might be a question or statement.
Go ahead.
In the adoption process, when with the rehoming, the feeling that I have about that, I thought about, I know it would be harsh to say to an adoptive parent, if it was your biological child and you had those problems, what would you do for your biological child? Kind of the concept of, would you give that child, I mean, you can't give your child back because that's your, so treating it as the same, as though your adopted child is your biological child, because it's really the same thing, because you just took on that child.
You know, it's a very hard thing for most therapists to wrap their brains around that with people that are giving away their kids. However, if you work in this field long enough, I'm telling you, DJJ could tell you, Baker Act facilities can tell you, there are a lot of biological parents that will not pick their kids up from a Baker Act and essentially are doing the same thing. So I don't know when we reached a point in our culture where it was optional to continue to raise your child. But there are a lot of facilities that will tell you that the lockout numbers are increasing. If your child has been acting up, if your child is involved with DJJ or has been Baker Acted or any one of a number of things, there's a lot of lockouts. And I don't know.
It's abandonment, right?
Yeah, it is. It's considered abandonment. And what happens, I don't end up seeing a lot of repercussions, legal repercussions for a lot of these situations. They do end up in foster care. We end up getting them for treatment. But parents are not always legally charged with anything. And it's kind of a mushy part of the law. As far as rehoming, Deanna, the thing with rehoming is that there's nothing legal about it. So you don't have to go to the court and say, I don't want my child anymore. You can just go on one of those websites and just as they did with Moses and type it in and say, I've got a child, he's 4.5, he weighs 42 pounds, he's got blue eyes, blonde hair, yada, 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 do you want him? And there's no legal repercussions.
That part makes me sick.
It's tough.
My stomach.
Yeah, it's, I can tell that I'm not glad I showed you the rehoming, but I'm glad I showed you the rehoming because it is a really tough thing. And the lady that drove the 10 hours to get the kid, the reason she did it is because these two people, if you got that, were in her chat room. She didn't know anything about them. And she's the one that essentially facilitated those kids going to that couple who ended up in prison for 40 years. but she didn't know. The only thing she knew about them is that they were all in this chat room together. And then when she discovered what had happened, she was horrified and felt like she had to take some action. So it's a tough part of the adoption world. Where you will meet it is if you get a child that's had a failed adoption, and some of your work is going to be very, very challenging because these kids have already been failed by their biological parents, and now they've been essentially abandoned by their adoptive parents. And very, very often when you really get into what the issues are, it wasn't so much what the child did. It was just unprepared adoptive parents with unrealistic expectations. So you will
don't think about the pain that they're causing these children in the long run.
Right. Well, in the first rehoming, the young man that kind of cavalierly adopted that kid for 6 months said, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I'll try it. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. He was just not at all understanding what was going to happen to that boy if he decided he didn't like him anymore. But again, if even just watching 10 seconds of that guy, if you were an adoption worker, would you ever have given that kid to that man? I mean,
Nope.
absolutely no idea about commitment.
Could I say for the guy that said that, he was like already had one foot out the door already, so that was not really gonna be much of a happy ending, because he didn't seem like he was willing to put a lot of effort. If he was like maybe disappointed or frustrated with the kid or had to do any type of parenting, really.
Right. He was a young single guy. He didn't have any children. And it was sort of like shopping for a kid. And in an adoption process, the adoption worker would be sitting with this guy saying, why do you want to adopt? What are your expectations for this? It's not, adopt a kid that you can play basketball with. But that's why rehoming is such a difficult concept. There's no regulations around it.
And he almost set him, he was setting himself up for failure before he even gave it a try.
Yeah.
Like that mindset, when you go in with that mindset, it's
Right.
negative. So
I always find that video so hard to watch because all of these, it was like the Roman gladiators, for God's sakes. All these people are kind of lined up watching these poor children kind of strut down the runway and try to sell themselves. And it does happen. It
the
does.
fashion show.
Yeah.
It was terrible.
A kid show. It's sort of a kid show. Pick a kid. But it does happen, and now you know. So you will be able to work with it. And I try to end this training on a positive note because you will do good work. You will. And you will be able to save adoptions because you're going to know so much more about this than you did when you started. So don't get too bogged down in the badness of it, because you will find that you will do some very good work, all of you. Okay, you guys. We will get together next week. Will be the last day that we do this is usually a shorter day. So shorter than this. This used to go to 4 o'clock, but it went to 4 o'clock mostly because it was so much more, there's so much more interaction when you're all here in person. So, but I appreciate any of you who say anything because it gives my voice a rest, and I feel like we get a lot from the things that you guys say. So have a good week, and I will see you next week. And I'm just going to send all of you the flyer, and then Melissa, you'll have it and you can plan on it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take it easy.
Now next week is on Wednesday, right? Is
No.
it Wednesday or Thursday?
Thursday.
I thought on
I have it written down as Wednesday as well. Like
because on the flyer that we got,
Yeah.
it said Wednesday, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
I wondered if that date was wrong.
I'm going
I
to
have it marked down for Wednesday.
Well, I'm really glad you said that because hold on, unless I made
Because it was the 28th.
Yeah.
And that's
yeah.
a mistake.
I'm sorry, the date was wrong, and I will send that out. We always do them on Thursday.
It's a
Okay,
good
so-
thing it's a good thing I said something. then.
I am glad you
Vegan.
said something. Yeah, it's the
And you
20
said, so you said we'll be done earlier that day, that Thursday, because I have my calendar marked off for Wednesday for that week, and I already have clients scheduled from 3 to 6 that afternoon. Will we be done by 3?
Yes, yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
okay.
All right, it's the 29th. It's Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for telling me that.
Bye.
Take it easy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good week.